dust, silence, and a missing treaty. Hey guys. Tonight we're cracking open the sleepy, creaky archive drawers of diplomatic history to wander through the tale of a peace treaty so forgotten, so ridiculously misplaced, that it stayed lost longer than some civilizations have existed 2 full centuries, to be exact. And somehow no one thought to check under the cheese cellar or behind a fireplace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the threshold of a massive stone building that hums with silence, the kind of old, institutional hush that seems to settle into the walls themselves. No creaking floors or birdsong here, just the muffled pulse of time, and maybe one slightly annoyed archivist in wool stockings who keeps losing his spectacles in his own wig. You open the heavy oak door and step into the chill of forgotten papers. Shelves stretch in every direction, stacked with boxes, scrolls, brittle letters, and leather-bound tomes. The air smells of mold, ink, and old diplomatic tension. You reach for a bundle labeled peace agreements, 17th-18th century, only to find inside a recipe for boiled eel and a rather cranky letter about sheep tariffs. You're already starting to suspect that someone back in the day was not particularly organized. The story we're unraveling tonight is the saga of the so-called 335 Years' War, which, despite its name, involved 0 battles, no casualties, and precisely 1 diplomatic mistake that would echo through archives until the mid-20th century. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1651, during the English Civil War, the Isles of Scilly, an isolated cluster of islands off the southwestern tip of England, were under royalist control. Supporting King Charles I at the time, the Netherlands, who had allied with Parliament, decided to retaliate against Scilly with a formal declaration of war. Sounds serious, right? Except ... nothing happened. No Dutch ships ever arrived. No cannons were fired. The entire war existed solely on paper, and eventually, everyone forgot it was happening, like the world's most awkward Zoom call left running in the background for centuries. Which leads us to tonight's first curiosity. No one ever declared peace. The Netherlands simply got busy with more pressing wars, and, like someone forgetting a subscription they never cancelled, the diplomatic file just drifted off into obscurity. Generations passed, monarchs rose and fell. Tea went from scandalous to standard, and the Isles of Scilly carried on blissfully unaware that, technically, they were still at war with the Dutch Republic. Now here's the quirky twist. The only reason we know about this so-called war is because of a history nerd with excellent eyebrows. In 1985, Roy Duncan, a historian and chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, stumbled upon an offhand remark in a dusty military record suggesting a war had once been declared but never ended. Curious, and probably needing a break from sheep census data, he contacted the Dutch embassy. To everyone's surprise, including the Dutch themselves, they confirmed there was no record of a peace treaty ever being signed. Thus began a diplomatic conversation that was both charmingly awkward and oddly formal. And yes, in 1986, 3 centuries and change after the initial declaration, a peace treaty was finally signed between Scilly and the Netherlands, ending the longest war in recorded history that featured exactly 0 fighting. You're standing now beside a wide creaking desk where the original documents may have once rested. If only someone hadn't spilled cider on them or used them to prop open a window. The air is thick with dust motes, drifting like lazy thoughts. It's here you encounter the lingering open scholarly debate. Was the war ever truly legitimate? Some argue the Dutch ambassador's declaration in 1651 was more symbolic than formal, lacking the full ratification typically required for official hostilities. Others insist that a legal declaration was indeed made, and just because no one followed through doesn't make it any less binding. The truth is, history is full of footnotes that grow fat over time. What began as a diplomatic footnote became a trivia fact, and from there a delightful example of bureaucratic inertia. And yet, it leaves behind a lingering question. How many other wars or treaties have been misplaced? How many conflicts have flickered in and out of existence, not on the battlefield, but in the margins of misfiled documents and forgotten clerks' notes? Your fingers brush to vellum-bound ledger dated 1683. You flip it open to reveal trade tallies, sheep, barrels of salted herring, a notation about parliamentary cheese discussions, and a brief entry in cramped handwriting. No cannon fire, This season, all quiet war persists. There's a sleepy kind of humor here, in the way entire generations simply shrugged and kept going. The Isles of Scilly, after all, had real things to worry about. Storms, shipwrecks, that one guy who kept trying to grow pineapples in clay pots. War with the Dutch, barely worth a comment at the local tavern. You wonder what the villagers would have done had someone actually remembered to inform them they were at war. Probably nothing. Maybe knit a banner, maybe shrug and go back to mending nets. That's the beauty of this story. It's not about violence or politics. It's about how easy it is for history to yawn and roll over when no one's watching. So you walk through the archive, fingers trailing across boxes labeled in fading ink, lost treaties, unsent letters, banana import dispute classified. Somewhere beneath your feet is a floorboard with a hollow echo pack. That's where the real treaty ended up, tucked beneath a loose plank or used as insulation during a particularly drafty winter. And still, the lesson lingers like the scent of old parchment sometimes. History's most absurd stories are also the most revealing. They remind us that even in matters of peace and war, human forgetfulness reigns supreme. Someone forgot to send a ship. Someone misplaced a file. Someone poured wine on the wrong page. And somewhere, an entire nation forgot they were still technically at war with a fishing village 400 kilometers away. The absurdity isn't just charming, it's instructive, because if something as big as a war can be forgotten, how many smaller stories have slipped entirely through the cracks? Tonight, you're the witness. You're the listener. You're the archivist of the forgotten war that fizzled out before it even began. You close the dusty box, you light a single candle, and in the stillness of this library of lost things, you finally understand that some stories are preserved, not by importance, but by accident, and sometimes that's enough. A war with no bang, just paperwork. You shuffle deeper into the archive corridors, the walls now narrowing into claustrophobic lanes of forgotten parchment and folders that look like they haven't been touched since powdered wigs were still considered fashionable. A chill clings to the air like an old whisper, one that's clearly been waiting centuries to be heard. You glance around, half expecting some phantom bureaucrat to step out and say, "Ah yes, the treaty, we've been expecting you since 1660, but no such luck, just more silence. Broken only by your own footsteps and the occasional crackle of brittle paper surrendering to age. You reach for a bound stack labeled conflicts of unusual duration, and you know you've struck bedtime gold. Inside is a section carefully annotated with the phrase, "Dispute with the Isles of Scilly, awaiting further instructions." That's right, awaiting further instructions. For over 3 centuries, if you ever needed proof that history sometimes just sets things down and walks away, this is it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the mid-17th century, England wasn't exactly having its best moment. Civil war had fractured the country into parliamentarians and royalists, and the Isles of Scilly, clinging like barnacles to the edge of Cornwall, found themselves caught up in this internal chaos. While the rest of Europe was trying to figure out alliances, the Dutch Republic, eager to secure its maritime interests, got swept up in this political mess. Admiral Martin Tromp, whose name, by the way, sounds like a Renaissance horn section, sailed toward the Isles, demanded restitution for royalist seizures of Dutch ships, and declared war when he got no reply. And then, he left. No blockade, no bombardment, no even mildly angry cannonball, just a stern Dutchman wagging a nautical finger before sailing off to more important matters. Now here's the quirky historical gem you didn't expect. The reason there was never any military action might have been due to poor sailing weather and some sheep. Seriously, there are scattered records indicating that high winds and rough waters prevented Dutch ships from anchoring near the Isles effectively, and once word reached Tromp that Parliament's forces were gaining ground inland, he may have thought, you know what, let's just call this a diplomatic warning and head home before anyone catches a cold. But did he formally call it off? No, that would have required paperwork, and we all know how that goes. Which brings us to tonight's scholarly debate, one that's both oddly niche and surprisingly enduring among diplomatic historians. Does a declared war exist if no hostile action follows it? According to some legal scholars, yes, if there's an official declaration. The war is considered valid until a formal peace treaty is signed. Others argue that without acts of war, no battles, no troop mobilization, no hostile occupation, the declaration becomes legally null over time. This debate has real-world implications too. In modern international law, the absence of a peace treaty can still impact territorial claims, trade negotiations, and even maritime boundaries. But in the case of Scilly and the Dutch Republic, It seems nobody noticed or cared enough to even test that theory. The war just sat there, like an unread message left on scene. Now walk with me through a corridor lit by dangling gas lamps that probably should have been replaced in 1910. You spot a wooden cabinet stamped Miscellaneous International Incidents, and it smells faintly of mothballs and citrus. You open up the drawer and find a faded map of the Isles of Scilly, complete with little doodled ships and arrows suggesting some long-forgotten admiral's daydream. Next to it, a teacup ring staining the corner of what appears to be a draft treaty. It's signed but not sealed, and it's addressed to the wrong monarch. You sigh. Another near miss in a story full of diplomatic almosts. You get the distinct sense that everyone involved in this war kept meaning to deal with it, but then got distracted by bigger problems, revolutions, invasions, taxes. This wasn't a war anyone remembered because it wasn't a war that touched anyone's life. There was no trauma, no grief, no scorched earth, just a piece of forgotten legislation floating somewhere in the ocean of history's inbox. You turn a corner and find a long, narrow table with quills still lying in their inkpots. Maybe ceremonial, maybe abandoned. You picture the moment it was all supposed to be made official. The Dutch ambassador with a cravat slightly askew, the English official double-checking his powdered wig, and someone off to the side loudly whispering, "Wait, did anyone bring the actual treaty?" You can practically hear the sighs and the shuffling of papers. One diplomat clears his throat and tries to improvise, perhaps beginning with "We the undersigned hereby declare that everyone agrees to be generally less annoyed going forward." But the meeting ends early when it starts to rain and someone's horse panics. Back in the archive you find a dusty box simply labeled "Pending." You lift the lid slowly, almost reverently, expecting treasure. Inside, an empty folder, of course. Fitting, really, because the treaty that was lost for 200 years wasn't stolen or burned or erased. It was shrugged into oblivion. And no one never looked too hard for it because everyone just assumed someone else had handled it. You lean back and let your gaze drift across rows of parchment and parchment-colored wallpaper. You wonder how many of these boxes contain treaties that were drafted and forgotten before the ink had dried, and you imagine the poor clerk who discovered the silly declaration centuries later, blinking into candlelight with a confused frown and muttering, "Wait, we're still at war with who?" It's this sleepy absurdity that makes the story so comforting. The idea that entire nations can forget to finish something important just like the rest of us forget keys or birthdays or why we walked into the kitchen. You imagine the final day of the war, March 17, 1986, when Dutch Ambassador Rein Heidkoper and Council Chairman Roy Duncan signed a formal peace treaty at last, more as a light-hearted gesture than anything else. You picture them chuckling over coffee, wondering how this odd historical oversight had lasted so long without anyone even raising an eyebrow. It's the gentlest war ending you can imagine. No parades, no salutes, just two men in suits tidying up the past like it was a misplaced library book. You run your fingers along the edge of the table and find a small inscription carved in childish script. "Peace lives in the quiet places." Probably someone just scribbling during a boring meeting, but it fits, because that's what this story really is. A quiet place in history, untouched by noise or violence, just forgotten enough to survive unspoiled. And now, here you are, the one who's remembered it. You close the box, the dust swirls like a sigh, and somewhere, a treaty sleeps a little easier tonight, because someone finally said its name. Filing errors in the ghost of the clerk as you walk through the next corridor of history's least urgent diplomatic archive. The temperature dips, slightly perhaps because of the thick stone walls. Or maybe because you've just entered the realm of bureaucratic ghosts. Not the spooky kind. Mind, rattling chains or eerie wails, just the sort that still clutches a feather quill and mutters about ink shortages. Here, you can almost hear the spectral sigh of a forgotten clerk who once handled war paperwork, Isles Division, and promptly misfiled the most prolonged undeclared ceasefire in European history under Miscellaneous. See also, herring disputes. The corridor narrows slightly, forcing you to angle your shoulders. On one side, boxes labeled trade routes. On the other, conflicts awaiting resolution. You pick up a fraying scroll near the bottom of the stack, and the parchment practically wheezes with age. It's a transcript from a meeting in 1652 between English diplomats and Dutch representatives. You lean in to read, expecting to find clarity. Instead, you're met with a series of vague notations like "issues still unresolved awaiting royal input and will reconvene when weather improves." It's as if they all simply got tired halfway through and went home for tea. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The 17th century saw more wars in Europe than perhaps any other century. Dutch naval supremacy was rising. Spain was still licking its imperial wounds, and England had just executed its own king. Amidst this whirlwind, the Netherlands were hyper-focused on protecting their shipping lanes and trade. Scilly, tiny though it was, posed a symbolic threat due to its royalist leanings and harboring of privateers. So, Trump's declaration wasn't entirely a prank. It was a strategic message wrapped in formality. But even then, it landed in the bottom drawer of diplomatic concern. The fringe fact: a handful of amateur historians believe the declaration may have been written in duplicate, but only one copy was ever delivered. The second copy, they argue, ended up being used to plug a window draft in a Dutch coastal office and was later mistaken for a decorative napkin. While unproven, one 19th-century Dutch museum claims to possess a water-damaged letter with the phrase "Oorlog verklaard war" declared barely legible beneath a wine stain. Of course, no one can agree if it's authentic or just an over-enthusiastic intern's doodle. And now for the open scholarly debate. Who exactly had the authority to ratify such a declaration on behalf of the Dutch Republic? Some scholars suggest Admiral Tromp may have overstepped his diplomatic role. As a military leader, he could enforce naval actions, but official war declarations typically required approval from the States General, the governing body of the Netherlands. Others argue that given the Republic's decentralized political structure, local admirals sometimes took it upon themselves to issue declarations in real time to protect shipping interests. In this case, there's no clear evidence either way. The war might have been valid, or it might have been just a strongly worded memo lost in translation. You glance at a shelf marked treaties and things we forgot. A single candle flickers on the table nearby, wax pooling like a slow argument. Your eyes catch a curious artifact, a bound volume titled Delays in Peace. Inside are letters, exchanged over decades, none of which resolve anything. One begins with, "We acknowledge receipt of your most recent inquiry," and ends with, "Pending further review." You can almost feel the collective shrug of an entire era. You pull out another letter, written in surprisingly neat cursive, which discusses the logistics of a treaty ceremony that never happened. There was to be a boat, a neutral port, a symbolic fruit basket, and a rather involved seating arrangement to prevent anyone from being perceived as more powerful. The letter ends with, "Postponed due to flu outbreak." No new date set. You can practically hear the meeting organizer groaning into their cravat. And so, year after year, generation after generation, the silly Dutch war lingered in a kind of historical limbo, not alive but not officially dead. You can imagine the bored apprentice clerk, probably someone named Tobias, who saw the papers, nodded thoughtfully, and stuffed them into the reschedule later folder behind some tavern tax receipts. Somewhere along the line, someone could have ended it. A signature, a second meeting. By the way, shall we call this whole thing off? But nobody did, and the world moved on. The absurdity of it all becomes clearer when you picture the villagers of Scilly in the 1700s, fishing and gossiping, entirely unaware that somewhere across the sea, they were still at war. It wasn't a war that loomed or caused dread, it was a war that drifted into irrelevance like an unpaid tab at a pub long since burned down. You pause by a worn table. On it sits a book of maritime law. Pages turn to a chapter titled Unfinished Conflicts. There's a footnote referencing the Scilly situation, phrased with such disinterest it might as well say, "Still a thing." Maybe you flip forward to a note scrawled in the margin, "Who even started this?" The question every historian eventually asks. The most poetic irony, though, is this. When the 1986 peace treaty was signed, it wasn't because of political urgency. It was because someone simply asked. Roy Duncan, local historian and council chairman of the Isles of Scilly, heard a rumor. He followed up. The Dutch embassy was surprised. Someone checked the records. And then, in a quiet moment of international cooperation, a centuries-old blip in the historical record was quietly resolved over tea and handshakes. You can almost see the modern Dutch ambassador looking at the treaty and saying, "Huh, so we never did finish that." And with a pen, 3 signatures, and some polite laughter, it was done. 335 years of paperwork closed not with a bang, but with a bite. Or the clerk's ghost, if he exists, surely sighed in relief. Back in the archive, you place the letters carefully back in their box. The air feels lighter somehow, as if one more chapter of forgotten history has been read and remembered. You notice the box label has been updated in fresh ink. Resolved. Finally, you smile. For all the grand events of history, the battles, the treaties, the revolutions, sometimes it's these quiet, absurd episodes that stay with us. They remind us that humanity isn't always efficient. It forgets, it misplaces, it shrugs, and in that gentle chaos something deeply human emerges. You extinguish the candle, its final smoke curling upward like a satisfied exhale. You walk slowly back through the corridor of sleepy disputes, the ghost of Tobias the clerk perhaps whispering a thank you behind you, and just before the door closes, you notice a new sign affixed to the archive wall. Pending peace treaties, all caught up for now. The island that forgot it was at war. The path you now walk feels softer underfoot, the stones worn down by centuries of shoes far more practical than yours. You step through a creaking archway that's part moss, part mortar, and part stubbornness. Before you, the Isles of Scilly stretch like a painter's afterthoughts, more quiet, beautiful, and thoroughly unconcerned that they were, until 1986, technically at war with a major European power. As you stroll through one of the tiny villages, you pass a post office that also functions as a cafe, a general store, and likely a local gossip hub. Someone inside is stirring tea while reading the daily news with a degree of interest that suggests the world could be on fire, but not until after lunch. This island doesn't feel like it could be at war with anyone except perhaps the seagulls. And yet, here you are. Here's your mainstream historical fact for tonight. The Isles of Scilly are a small archipelago, just off the southwestern tip of England, consisting of about 140 islands, only 5 of which are inhabited. During the 17th century, they were under the influence of royalist forces, while the rest of England was increasingly controlled by parliamentarians. Because of this political alignment and their use as a harbour for privateers, Scilly became an indirect thorn in the side of Dutch maritime interests, which is how the whole forgotten war began in the first place. But here's where it gets delightfully strange. Your fringe fact for the night. There is no evidence that a single person on the Isles of Scilly ever knew they were at war. Not once, over the course of 335 years, did anyone raise a flag, hide in a cellar, or even consider that their sunny outcrop of rocky coastline and daffodils was technically under threat. No military action, no cannon fire, not even a sternly worded postcard from The Hague. It's the only war in recorded history where not one participant on one side seemed to be aware it was happening. You reach a low stone wall overlooking the sea, and it's easy to imagine a local farmer squinting out at the waves, wondering whether the clouds will bring rain, not Dutch warships. In the 1800s, the islands were mostly preoccupied with shipwrecks, pilchard fishing, and arguing over who made the best scones. War that was someone else's concern, likely the mainlands where people wore wigs ironically, which brings us to tonight's open scholarly debate. What qualifies as war memory when no one involved actually remembers being at war? This question fascinates historians who specialize in cultural memory. Typically, even the briefest of wars leave behind echoes, memorials, songs, bitter stories passed down over drinks. But in the case of Scilly versus the Dutch Republic, there's a void. No local tales, no village plaques, not even a humorous footnote until the 20th century. Some argue this absence of memory makes the war more myth than history. Others insist the treaty's delayed conclusion proves that even forgotten conflicts can leave paper trails more enduring than cannon fire. You wander now into the village museum, no grand building, just a cheerful two-room cottage that smells faintly of lavender and old rope. The curator, a woman who looks like she's memorized every name on the island, waves you in. You're shown a clipping from 1983, where a schoolchild discovered the war during a research project. The tone of the article is amused, vaguely apologetic. Turns out we've been at war with the Dutch. Who knew? It's signed off with no hard feelings. You smile only on Scilly. A display case features a replica of the 1986 peace treaty, which looks like it was typed on an office typewriter during someone's tea break. The photo beneath it shows Ambassador Rain Hydecoper shaking hands with Council Chairman Roy Duncan on St. Mary's Island. Both men are grinning, clearly aware of the ceremony's absurd charm. The caption simply reads, "Peace at last." You continue past shelves filled with seashells and lighthouse paraphernalia. No war medals, no uniforms. The only reference to conflict is a faded board game titled Smugglers and Redcoats, missing half its pieces. Back outside, a garden blooms with forget-me-nots, which feels ironic. You follow a footpath lined with low hedges and the occasional sunbathing cat. The sun is beginning to dip behind the hills, turning the sea a molten silver. You imagine the centuries rolling by, the rise and fall of empires, the clash of ideologies, the relentless march of modernity. And here, on this dot in the Atlantic, nothing, just tide, fish, and tea. Somewhere in that stillness lies the beauty of this story. It's not that Scilly was forgotten, it's that Scilly forgot to remember. It never knew it needed to. And that, perhaps, is what made this conflict so uniquely human, because the history we forget says just as much about us as the history we cherish. Back on the mainland, debates raged, treaties were penned, and historians but scratched their heads over this curious oversight. But out here, the people just kept living, planting gardens, repairing boats, waving at the postman. It wasn't apathy, it was peace, practiced daily and unceremoniously. That kind of peace doesn't need declarations or fanfare, it just needs time. And the Isles had plenty of that. As you walk back through the twilight, you hear the distant bell of a harbor buoy, rhythmic and soft. It's the only thing that marks time out here, and even it doesn't seem in much of a hurry. You glance back at the village one last time. It doesn't feel like a place that was ever at war. But that's the magic, isn't it? For over 3 centuries, it wasn't, yet it wasn't. A contradiction written in silence, resolved in laughter. And now you've seen it, this forgotten front in a war that never truly happened. You keep walking, the wind picking up just enough to carry the scent of salt, and maybe, just maybe, a sigh of relief from a treaty that no one saw coming, and no one really missed. The ambassador who asked a silly question. You find yourself seated now at a small, imaginary table, the kind where tea is always hot and the biscuits never run out. Across from you sits a man in a crisp suit, flipping through a folder so thin it could double as a placemat. His name is Rein Heidkoper, the Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom in the mid-1980s. He looks up with a bemused expression, as if he's about to tell you a joke and isn't quite sure if you'll laugh. You're in a fictional memory of a very real meeting in 1985, when a sleepy historian from the Isles of Scilly, Roy Duncan, wrote to the Dutch embassy with what can only be described as one of the most polite diplomatic nudges in history. We seem to recall being at war with your country. Might we, perhaps, consider peace? The ambassador reads the letter, arching one eyebrow. It's the kind of moment that belongs in a sitcom more than a state archive. And yet, here it was, the catalyst that finally brought an end to the longest technically active war in European history. Your mainstream historical fact. In 1986, the Netherlands officially signed a peace treaty with the Isles of Scilly. That's right, after 335 years of legal but entirely unbloody conflict. The Dutch government agreed to close the file. Was a cheerful, light-hearted ceremony held at the tiny island of St. Mary's, attended by local council members, schoolchildren, and journalists who smelled a story that was both charming and refreshingly free of political tension. Ambassador Heidkoper was quoted as saying he was happy to bring an end to a 335-year-old state of war, doing so with a wry smile that seemed fully aware of the absurdity. And your fringe fact. The treaty signing took place in a small council chamber with a guest list that included several bemused Dutch officials, a local historian, and exactly 0 security personnel. No red carpets, no armed guards, just people in practical shoes, shaking hands over a formality that nobody felt particularly pressured to resolve for 3 centuries. The document was typed, photocopied, and filed in a drawer that probably also contained biscuit recipes and notes about the next community fundraiser. But this gentle act of diplomacy had one strange result. It officially extended the known duration of a war that, by all accounts, never occurred in any conventional way. Which brings us to tonight's scholarly debate. What makes a conflict real if it has no casualties, no battles, and no contemporary awareness? Is war simply a legal state, an inked declaration buried in some foreign file room? Or does it require active hostility, military orders, or even awareness from those supposedly involved? International law tends to define war based on intent, not just action. So in the eyes of treaty law, the Scilly Dutch War was indeed real. But philosophers and historians argue that without memory or engagement, such a war enters a kind of quantum unreality existing only in paperwork, not in lived experience. You sit back and watch as Roy Duncan recounts how he stumbled onto the whole affair. The year was 1983, and Roy was flipping through references in the Isles, local archives, when he came across a vague mention of an unresolved Dutch conflict. Curious, he wrote to the Dutch embassy, expecting a laugh. Instead, he got an intrigued reply. That one letter sparked an international verification process that lasted several months. The Dutch combed through their archives, finally confirming that yes, in the legal records, the declaration of war by Admiral Tromp had never been formally withdrawn. The file had gathered 3 centuries worth of dust, sitting under a heading so obscure it might as well have read Historical Oddities. See also Forgotten Cheese Taxes. When the 2 sides agreed to hold a peace ceremony, it was done with equal parts humor and respect. On the day of the treaty, local school children sang songs. There were paper doves. Someone brought a homemade banner. The peace treaty was signed, exchanged, and smiled over, and just like that, one of history's oddest chapters was gently closed, not with political fanfare, but with tea, laughter, and a handshake. You look around the imaginary room and think about how most conflicts end: treaties hammered out under pressure, peace negotiated after immense loss. But here, in the quiet of a forgotten archipelago, peace was less a necessity and more an act of historical housekeeping, like dusting a shelf you didn't know was there. The ambassador stood at the podium that day and joked, "Let this be a lesson in the dangers of not keeping one's paperwork in order." The crowd chuckled. You imagine Tobias the ghost clerk somewhere in the archives groaning softly, muttering about misfiled memos and misplaced inkpots. This entire story offers something rare in historical narratives: a moment where everything ended well. No tragedies, no betrayals, just a long-forgotten mistake, corrected with good humor and mutual curiosity. As twilight spreads across the village green, you can almost see the echoes of that treaty signing in the quiet way the town goes about its evening. Peace, it turns out, is often less about negotiation and more about intention. And intention, once lost, can take 335 years to rediscover. You walk away from the table and into the fresh night air, stars now piercing the indigo sky like notes on a music sheet. You think of all the wars that didn't end this way, and you're grateful for this strange, sleepy little exception: a war with no wounds, a peace with no conditions, just a letter, a handshake, and the most polite end to a war that the world forgot had even started. Admiral Tromp and the Thunderclap Declaration. You walk along a narrow path, flanked by wind-tousled grass and the ever-present murmur of waves somewhere out of sight. A gull cries overhead, and for just a moment the soft breeze carries the ghost of gunpowder, imagined of course, but tied to the tale you're about to unravel. You pause near a weathered wooden bench facing the sea, and settle in to revisit the man who unintentionally launched one of history's oddest non-wars: Admiral Martin Tromp. He's not here, obviously. He died in 1653, but his legacy lingers, particularly in maritime law. You imagine him with wild seafaring eyes, heavy boots, and a sword that clanked against everything within arm's reach. Martin Tromp was one of the great naval commanders of the Dutch Republic during the 17th century, famously brilliant and spectacularly stubborn. And here comes tonight's mainstream historical fact: Tromp led the Dutch fleet during the First Anglo-Dutch War 165 to 1654, a bitter and frequently chaotic maritime conflict driven by trade, pride, and more than a little mutual annoyance between the Dutch and the English. One day, while chasing royalist privateers who had been using the Isles of Scilly as a base of operations, Tromp decided he'd had enough of the nonsense. The story goes that Tromp, either in frustration or formal retaliation, issued a declaration of war specifically against the Isles of Scilly, not England as a whole. The decision was hasty, and possibly not even properly recorded by Tromp himself, but it was referenced in official Dutch documents later. That paper trail, as absurd as it sounds, made the war relevant parchment, at least. Now for the fringe fact: the declaration may not have followed the full diplomatic process. Some scholars suggest Tromp made the declaration verbally, or through a local letter, and that it was recorded more as a military formality than an actual order to engage. In other words, it might have been the 17th century equivalent of slapping a "Don't Make Me Come Over There" sticker on a cannon, and sailing past. This war, if we can call it that, had no logistical plan, no follow-up, and no records of action. Tromp simply declared war, sailed away, and, like most of us, probably forgot the whole thing during his next naval engagement. And here's where it gets scholarly. Was Tromp's declaration an act of state or a rogue gesture by a hot-headed admiral? Historians still debate whether Tromp had the authority to unilaterally declare war, particularly on a subset of English territory that was not independently sovereign. Some argue that, due to the decentralized nature of the Dutch Republic at the time, where different provinces held varying degrees of power, Tromp's actions could be interpreted either as legitimate military procedure or personal improvisation. Either way, no one back home in the Dutch government seemed particularly concerned. It was wartime after all, and paperwork didn't travel as fast as sails. Imagine standing on Scilly's windswept shore in 1651, seeing the Dutch fleet on the horizon, thinking they might be here for fish or trade, and then hearing that they've declared war on your mossy little island. What do? Hide the cows? Cancel market day? More likely, you did nothing, because no one actually heard the declaration. The islands were too remote, and local communication was slow. Which brings us to your gentle chuckle of the evening. Tromp may have started a war that the other side never knew had begun. like setting a trap in the forest and never telling the animal. As you continue your walk, you find yourself imagining a version of Trump who, after making his hasty declaration, turned to his crew and muttered something, like that'll show them, before going back to organizing rum rations. Perhaps he believed the threat alone would deter royalist cooperation. Or perhaps he was just exasperated by the endless bureaucracy of European conflict. It's even possible that the whole event was a bluff, a theatrical gesture to send a message, though, that didn't stop it from becoming canon in the historical record. The First Anglo-Dutch War continued on, bloody and chaotic, without any further action towards Scilly, and by the time peace was made between England and the Dutch in 1654, the detail about Scilly's individual status was simply left out, like forgetting to cancel a subscription that's still charging you 335 years later. You step over a patch of clover, thinking about how many wars in history started with formal, calculated steps, ambassadors summoned, lines drawn on maps, national flags lowered and raised. But this one began with a nautical sigh and was shelved almost immediately. It is, in its strange and accidental way, a perfect metaphor for the absurdities of early modern diplomacy. The Scilly Declaration became a historical glitch, a forgotten subfolder in the great archive of European conflict. No one followed up. No one checked in. It became the diplomatic equivalent of an out-of-office reply that kept auto-sending for centuries. As the wind curls around your coat and the path takes you past a crumbling outpost once used to watch the horizon for pirates, you can't help but smile. The idea that an entire war could be declared in a moment of then forgotten by all parties is almost too perfect. It shows just how thin the line between drama and farce can be. And in a world that's often overwhelmed with conflict and consequence, there's something quietly wonderful about a war that simply never happened. A war declared out of spite, never acted upon, and later solved with a handshake and a press release. You pass a small plaque nailed to the side of a building that reads, in fading script, "Peace declared, 1986. There's no crowd, no candlelight vigil, just ivy curling around the stone and a sleepy cat nearby." The plaque, like the war it commemorates, is mostly ignored and all the more endearing for it. Scilly life goes on without a clue. You turn onto a path that gently curves toward a small cottage whose whitewashed walls are softened by climbing ivy and a scatter of wildflowers along the front. Inside, you imagine a cozy kitchen where the kettle whistles cheerfully and someone is buttering a scone with complete indifference to global politics. This isn't fiction. This was daily life on the Isles of Scilly for the better part of 4 centuries. From the mid-1600s to the end of the Cold War, the residents of Scilly lived, worked, laughed, married, and died in blissful ignorance of the peculiar little footnote in history that claimed they were technically still at war with the Dutch Republic. Your boots crunch over loose gravel as you pass by what looks like a very old postbox, still in use, still read, and possibly still unaware of any Dutch hostilities. Your mainstream historical fact: the Isles of Scilly, despite their minuscule size, have been continuously inhabited since prehistoric times. Archaeological finds reveal Bronze Age burial sites, Iron Age villages, and Roman relics scattered across the islands. By the 17th century, the islands were strategically important for maritime activity, especially for the Royalists during the English Civil War. But their value wasn't so much in military might, it was in location. Situated off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, Scilly offered an ideal base for privateering. The Royalist supporters who controlled the islands made life difficult for Dutch shipping, which is why Tromp got involved in the first place. But after that declaration, nothing. Literally, nothing. And here's your fringe fact. Not only did the islanders never fight the Dutch, they never even received formal word of the war. There were no proclamations nailed to the village well, no emergency meetings of the Fishery Council, and certainly no Dutch soldiers seen lurking behind hedgerows. In fact, the Isles of Scilly became a sort of sleepy maritime outpost, occasionally visited by naval ships for maintenance or resupply, but largely overlooked by major powers. There were no battles, no alliances, no shifts in allegiance, just gardening, fishing, and the occasional local scandal involving cheese theft or smuggling. Which brings us to the scholarly debate: does a population need to be aware of a war in order for it to count as real history? Most historical narratives involve trauma, collective memory, and some kind of legacy. But Scilly's war has none of these. Scholars in military history often wrestle with this. Should we consider this a conflict if there was no shared experience of it among the people supposedly at war? Some say yes, legal status alone is enough. Others argue that Lived experience is the true mark of historical legitimacy. Either way, it creates a bizarre paradox. An entire community was technically part of a centuries-long war, and no one thought to mention it, remember it, or even whisper about it over pints of ale. You make your way toward a small harbor, where weathered boats bob in the salt sweet tide. One of them is painted blue, with the name Restless Wind scrolled across its side in faded white. The harbor looks unchanged in decades. A man in a knit cap waves from the deck as he coils rope that has no idea it's been living through diplomatic tension for over 3 centuries. You glance over at the local inn, once a meeting house in the 18th century. Inside, the walls are covered with maps and nautical charts. One corner contains a dusty framed certificate titled Peace Treaty, 1986. A bartender once joked, "We kept it next to the Guinness tap." Seemed fitting. You take a seat on a bench beside the docks and watch a few kids skip stones. Behind them, someone tends to a garden where leeks and lavender grow in rows side by side. It's a scene unchanged by time. You think about how Scilly has always existed in a kind of charming parallel reality, a bit too far for politics, a bit too quiet for revolutions. While wars tore through Europe, Napoleonic invasions, 2 world wars, the Cold War, Scilly remained calm, detached, and more interested in the tide tables than in treaties, and that calm wasn't feigned, it was authentic. Even the local records make no mention of the war. The archives include letters, court proceedings, marriage licenses, and notes about the upkeep of roads, but nothing, not a whisper, about a war with the Dutch. The silence is almost poetic. It's as if the war only lived on paper, and paper alone never made much noise in a place ruled by waves and winds. You wander through a small churchyard next past lichen-covered gravestones where names like Tregarthon and Penrose rest under weathered inscriptions. Generations pass through this place completely unaware of their nation's peculiar diplomatic status. And why would they care? The bread still needed baking. The boats needed patching. A sheep on Guy Island had gone missing again, and that was the kind of crisis that stirred attention. You stop at one particularly old stone, its edges blurred by rain and time. It belongs to a woman named Elspeth Trenwith, who died in 1731. For all we know, Elspeth lived her whole life during wartime and never once heard the term Dutch. You wonder what she would have thought about it. Perhaps she'd laugh, or maybe she'd nod sagely and say, "That sounds about right." The notion that war can be so subtle, so bureaucratic that it leaves no scars, only dusty treaties and puzzled historians, is oddly comforting. Not every war must be a tragedy. Some can simply be paperwork filed too late, resolved with a shrug. And that's the real gift of the Scilly story. It reminds us that history doesn't always need drama to be memorable. Sometimes, the most astonishing thing is the absence of drama. A war forgotten by its participants. A peace declared with handshakes and tea. As you rise and follow the path back to town, the sun casts golden light across the hedgerows. Children laugh in the distance. A dog barks at nothing in particular. The sea keeps rolling in, unconcerned with treaties or declarations. And above it all, the sky stretches wide, calm, and completely at peace. The Dutch forget too, and then remember the cobbled street beneath your feet is uneven, worn smooth by centuries of lazy steps and rain-soaked afternoons. You walk slowly now, passing a bakery that smells faintly of honey and burnt crusts, and think about how long it took for anyone on either side of this very quiet war to remember it had ever begun. Because it wasn't just the residents of Scilly who forgot about the conflict. The Dutch, famous for their meticulous record-keeping and legendary for filing things away in thick leather-bound ledgers, also lost the thread. And this brings us to your mainstream historical fact. Even in the heart of The Hague, among the dusty archives and diplomatic records, there was no urgent effort to track down or formally end this peculiar war. For centuries, it sat in limbo, neither active nor resolved, simply overlooked by both time and attention. And here's your delightfully fringe fact. It wasn't the Dutch Foreign Ministry, nor a passionate international law student, nor even a curious historian from the Netherlands who rediscovered the war. No, it was an amateur British historian, named Roy Duncan, someone who simply liked poking around in dusty corners, who sent a letter in 1983 that stirred up a centuries-long diplomatic yawn. It's the kind of story that makes you want to clap politely. Duncan had been researching the English Civil War and came across a passing mention of the Scilly-Dutch conflict. Curious, and with time on his hands, he wrote to the Dutch embassy in London and asked, "So, are we technically still at war?" This prompted a slow cascade of diplomatic activity, more sleepy than scandalous. Officials were confused. Archivists looked at one another. Someone probably spilled their tea. Eventually, Dutch diplomatic staff confirmed that yes, there was a technical state of war, and no peace treaty had ever been signed. The entire discovery took place in a haze of polite emails, mildly startled conversations, and a remarkable lack of panic. That's the tone we're going for here, gentle, bemused, and utterly unfazed. Now here's the open scholarly debate. Should long-forgotten diplomatic declarations still carry legal weight centuries later? In international law, treaties and declarations, once made, do not simply expire. There is no statute of limitations on war. Unless an agreement is formally withdrawn or replaced, it remains valid even if it's absurd. But does this principle make sense when neither party remembers the conflict, acted upon it, or kept records of any kind? Legal scholars are divided. Some argue that formality matters above all that documents, no matter how dusty defined international relations. Others believe in the principle of desuetude, a legal concept where laws or obligations that have gone unused or unenforced for long periods lose their authority. The Silly Dutch War, in many ways, is the poster child for this argument. Imagine two librarians discovering that a book was checked out in 1651 and never returned, only to find that no one, not even the library, knew the book existed anymore. You stroll through a patch of low fog now, your fingers tracing the cool, iron railing beside a stone bridge. You think about how the Dutch themselves responded once the forgotten war came to light. Ambassador Rain Wyder Cooper, when he finally made the trip to the Isles of Scilly in 1986, did so not out of panic, nor even duty, but out of good humor and historical curiosity. He shook hands with local council leaders, signed the peace treaty with a smile, and reportedly enjoyed a slice of cake afterwards. That's diplomacy done right. You pause by a flower stall, where a pot of heather sways gently in the wind. The shopkeeper hums an old tune, entirely unaware of her role in the great geopolitical reset of the 1980s. And that's the thing. This entire chapter of history only came full circle because someone asked a simple question, not with urgency, not with outrage, just curiosity. Are we still at war? That single question peeled back centuries of silence and revealed a delightful oddity to nations accidentally entangled in a conflict so forgotten, it was practically fictional. You walk into a local bookshop next. Inside, nestled between guides on birdwatching and recipe books for elderflower jelly, is a thin booklet titled The War That Wasn't. You flip it open. A map, a portrait of Admiral Tromp, a timeline that stretches from 1651 to 1986 like a joke with an extremely delayed punchline. The author, of course, is Roy Duncan, the same local historian who started it all. The shopkeeper sees you reading and says, "Lovely little story, that one. Imagine being at war and no one telling you." You smile and nod. You imagine that's exactly how most of the Dutch must have felt too. In Amsterdam, Leiden, and The Hague, life had marched on uninterrupted. The war, such as it was, caused no headlines, no troop deployments, and no diplomatic arguments. It was, in effect, a phantom illegal shadow cast by a hasty admiral and forgotten by all who should have noticed. Back outside, you wander toward the edge of the harbor, where wooden pylons jut from the water like sleepy sentinels. The waves lap gently, whispering secrets only historians will ever care about. And in this moment it occurs to you that the greatest value of the Silly Dutch War is not its drama, but its whimsy. It offers a reminder that history, like people, sometimes forgets itself. That nations can hold grudges they never knew they had, that peace can be a piece of paper left unsigned in a filing cabinet. And that resolving it can come down to nothing more than a letter and a handshake. You take a deep breath. The salt is thick in the air. A bell chimes in the distance. Somewhere, perhaps, an archivist is smiling quietly at the thought of a war so gentle, even the paperwork took a nap. You continue walking. The island serene. Its sky wide, its people busy with other things completely at peace. A treaty, a handshake, and Tihor wandering along a winding coastal path now. The wind light but persistent as it nudges at your collar and flutters the sleeves of your jacket. Somewhere behind you, the distant clink of teacups being set on saucers echoes from a harbor cafe. But here, it's just you, the breeze, and the story of how an entire war was ended with more ceremony for the teapot than the treaty itself. This is where things get properly amusing and surprisingly heartwarming. After Roy Duncan's discovery in the early 1980s that a war had technically existed between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly since 1651, a flurry of soft diplomacy began. But let's not pretend this was the kind of international tension that made world leaders sweat. No, sir. The Dutch embassy in London chuckled. Scilly's local council raised a collective eyebrow. and with the kind of good-natured bemusement that only islanders and seasoned bureaucrats can muster, they decided to set the matter right. Your mainstream historical fact. In April 1986, over 300 years after Admiral Trump supposedly declared war, Dutch Ambassador Reinhard Koper traveled to Scilly to officially sign a peace treaty. The event, held in the council chambers of St. Mary's, was attended by local officials, a few curious residents, and this is not a joke, small but determined flock of seagulls outside who were deeply unimpressed by the historical significance. The ambassador, dressed neatly with the air of someone enjoying a pleasant day trip rather than ending a centuries-long war, smiled throughout. There was no security detail, no flashing cameras, just handshakes, good humor, and a gentle sense of closure. But here comes the fringe fact. The peace treaty itself was drafted more like a historical artifact than a legal necessity. It was largely symbolic, handwritten on a single page, with elegant if slightly cheeky language that acknowledged the long-standing lack of hostility between the two parties. It didn't come with grand signatures, embossed seals, or legal jargon. Instead, it was framed as a gesture, a polite nod to historical tidiness, rather than the end of anything dangerous. And yes, there was tea, possibly cake, almost certainly biscuits, because if you're going to end a 335-year-long war, you might as well do it with a warm beverage and a polite round of applause. That brings us to the open scholarly debate. Does a symbolic peace treaty hold any real diplomatic power? Most scholars agree that because the war had never been formally pursued, no damage had been done, and no hostilities ever exchanged. The act of signing a treaty was more performative than legal. Yet others argue that acknowledging a treaty centuries later sets a precedent. It reminds us that forgotten wars, declarations left unaddressed, and diplomatic technicalities do have historical weight. Some worry that such symbolic gestures, if taken too lightly, could dilute the seriousness of formal treaties. Others say, nonsense, this was a perfect example of history being gently tucked in like a child at bedtime. You walk past a cluster of low stone buildings now, some of them turned into quaint holiday cottages, their doorways flanked by flower boxes overflowing with petunias. You imagine a guest arriving, unaware they are sleeping on land that was once at war, sipping coffee in the morning as waves roll lazily ashore. There's a quiet delight in this contrast between the trivial and the historic. The same ground, walked by generations of sheep and fishermen, is now the site of a peace treaty that, if nothing else, gave historians and trivia enthusiasts something to smile about. You pause by a wooden sign that reads, "Peace declared -1986. It's nailed crookedly to a white wall, the paint chipping around the edges. Someone's drawn a smiley face in the corner. It's not disrespectful, it's fitting. The whole affair was absurd, charming, and gently surreal. It didn't need pomp, it needed personality. And it had plenty. Here's a little twist of irony for you. Because the Dutch ambassador came on official diplomatic business, his presence technically made the event the highest-level Dutch state visit to Scilly in recorded history. So, in a sense, a phantom war triggered one of the most unique diplomatic meetings the islands ever hosted, all without a cannon fired, a letter bombed, or a single demand shouted. Instead, the Dutch offered warmth and wit. The Cylonians, in turn, offered tea and hospitality. And so the war, long dormant, mostly forgotten, was brought to a sleepy end. But wait, there's more. Because what followed the treaty was perhaps even more delightful than the ceremony itself. Nothing changed. No new taxes, no policy shifts, no sudden spike in commemorative fridge magnets. Life simply continued. People laughed, shrugged, and went on with their days. And maybe that's the most peaceful piece of all, the kind that doesn't require anyone to explain why it took so long. You pass a small cafe on the corner now where a blackboard outside advertises treaty cakes. Ask inside whether that's real or a running local joke. It doesn't matter. It's all part of the charm. The story of the Scilly Dutch peace isn't about drama or resolution. It's about simplicity. It's about a mistake left unchecked, a declaration left unopened, and the joy of discovering that not every bit of history has to come with hardship. Some of it can just be funny. You settle on a bench overlooking the harbor, where the tide has rolled in again, steady and calm. You imagine Reinhard Koper standing here in '86, looking out over the same view, smiling at the absurdity of it all. He may have signed the treaty, but the peace had already lived here for hundreds of years in the sea, in the wind, and in the quiet lives of people who didn't even know they were meant to be tense. And perhaps that's the hidden lesson tonight. Sometimes, peace is simply the absence of remembering to be at war. Historians versus bureaucracy. Who remembers what you step off the path now? wandering into a tiny stone library with a slanted roof, probably older than most modern governments, and you can already smell the musty pages of books that haven't but been borrowed in years. The floor creaks beneath your feet, like it's sighing in response to the absurdity of what you're about to find inside. A war so thoroughly buried by time and dust that even historians and bureaucrats can't agree on whether it actually counted. That's where we are now, deep into the paperwork, the archival black holes, and the wonderful world of conflicting footnotes. So let's start with the mainstream historical fact. During the English Civil War, the Isles of Scilly became a royalist stronghold under the control of Sir John Grenville, loyal to the crown. This was a problem for the Dutch, because the royalists based conveniently on these islands had a nasty habit of seizing Dutch merchant ships. Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp sailed by, made a fuss, and reportedly declared war in retaliation. The catch: there's no surviving written document of this declaration. That's where everything gets gloriously messy. Enter your fringe fact. While British law clings to this 1651 declaration of war like a cozy sweater full of holes, Dutch archives seem oddly blank, not just quiet, blank. Despite the Netherlands being famously good at keeping organized city ledgers, church documents, receipts for tulip bulbs worth more than houses, no official record of the war declaration has been found. Scholars have combed through maritime correspondence and foreign ministry logs, but all they've turned up are references to diplomatic confusion and a few vague letters. It's like someone sneezed the original declaration into a fireplace, and nobody noticed. That leads us, rather elegantly, to the open scholarly debate. If a war is declared but not documented, does it legally exist? This is not just a philosophical question. It's a legal headache wrapped in parchment and wax seals. Some historians argue that even if Trump made an oral declaration, if it was understood and acknowledged by both parties at the time, it should count. Others insist that, without a written record, the declaration is hearsay, colorful, curious, but ultimately just a story. You walk deeper into the library, fingers tracing the spines of weathered volumes. There's something comforting about the idea that two entire nations could be tangled in a legalistic shrug for over 3 centuries. It's like history decided to play a long, slow, practical joke, then forgot the punchline. You find a small desk with a plaque that reads Local Archives, and next to it a thick binder titled Odd Correspondences, 17th Century Naval Diplomacy. You flip it open. Page 1, a letter from a Dutch envoy in 1653, referencing the Scilly nuisance. That's right, the war, if it happened, began as a footnote in someone's complaint about stolen goods and rude behavior. You lean back in your chair, the wood creaking just as much as your curiosity. Imagine being a historian tasked with piecing together an entire conflict from whispers and rumors. One letter references tension. Another implies confusion. A third suggests the Dutch were more concerned about their trade routes than the Cylonians themselves. And yet, the war made its way into the margins of history, surviving not through cannon fire or treaties, but through trivia nights and tourism brochures. Here's a lesser-known twist. In the early 20th century, a few legal scholars stumbled upon the Scilly story and thought it was fake. Literally, they labeled it as folklore, right alongside tales of mermaids off Cornwall and pirates in polite waistcoats. It wasn't until Roy Duncan's accidental rediscovery in the embassy's eventual response in the 1980s that anyone took the matter seriously again. And even then, seriously is doing a lot of heavy lifting. You glance at the window, where soft rain begins to tap against the old glass in a pattern that feels almost like a Morse code of forgotten facts. You imagine two bureaucrats, one Dutch, one British, sitting across from each other at a London embassy, sipping lukewarm coffee, debating whether or not a phantom war requires paperwork to end. One of them says, "Well, if we can't find it, it probably didn't happen." The other responds, "Then why are we still talking about it?" And round it goes. You return the binder gently to the shelf and step back outside. The rain has stopped, and the cobblestones are glistening under a break in the clouds. You take a deep breath. Even the air seems unsure of itself here. It's the perfect setting for a story that defies historical convention. In a world obsessed with clarity, timelines, causes, outcomes, the Scilly War reminds us that not all history fits neatly into spreadsheets or textbooks. Some of it lingers in jokes, in oral traditions, in the ambiguous nods of people who are mostly just confused. And sometimes, that's enough. You wander past a pub with a wooden sign that reads the Admiral's Whisper, probably named after Trump himself, though locals will tell you it refers to the way the wind hisses through the chimney. You step inside. The warmth hits you like a wool blanket. A few locals glance up and nod, but no one bothers to ask why you look like you've just seen a ghost. After all, here, history is a living room, quiet, slightly disorganized, but always sitting in the corner chair with a raised eyebrow. You sit near the fire, letting the heat soak into your boots, and imagine what would have happened if no one had ever discovered the war. Would it still be going on? Would someone in 2051 suddenly say, "Wait a minute, we're still at war"? It's the kind of story that doesn't need embellishment. The facts, or lack thereof, are bizarre enough. And so you sit, sipping something warm, in a place that once accidentally hosted a war. A war no one fought. A war no one remembered. A war that has left behind only questions, smiles, and a peculiar peace. The Isles of Scilly, a war without a battlefield. You're standing at the edge of the water again. This time with your boots nudging into the soft sand of a beach so quiet, even the gulls seem to have taken a vow of silence. The Isles of Scilly stretch before you like a painter's afterthought, low green, oddly serene. If you're looking for the battlefield of this famously forgotten war, this is it. Or rather, this is as close as you're going to get. No cannonballs ever flew overhead. No fleets clashed in the distance. No smoke curled from shattered rooftops. Just tides rolling in and rolling out. That's the charm of this strange, sleepy conflict. No one ever came to fight. And yet, it was still called a war. Your mainstream historical fact is this: the Isles of Scilly, located about 28 miles southwest of Cornwall, were never intended to be a military power. During the English Civil War, however, they found themselves suddenly relevant because they were isolated, loyal to the Royalists, and conveniently placed along maritime trade routes that made them a thorn in the side of the Dutch, who relied heavily on English Channel commerce. But what makes the Scillies even more fascinating is how little they were physically touched by the war. No battles occurred on land. The Dutch fleet, under Admiral Tromp, arrived offshore, lingered briefly, and left like a tourist deciding the weather wasn't worth staying for. Which leads us to the fringe fact of this section. Locals on the Scillies at the time of Tromp's so-called war declaration likely had no idea they were at war with anyone. Records from the mid-17th century on the islands are spotty at best, but nowhere do they mention alarm bells, military drills, or sudden diplomatic panic. It's as if Tromp declared war into a fog and sailed away before the echo returned. In fact, some historians suggest the declaration was more of a performative gesture, symbolic. We've had enough aimed at the English royalists, with the Scillies simply standing in for convenience. There's even a question of whether Tromp ever intended for the declaration to have weight, or whether it was simply theatre for frustrated merchants and Dutch Parliament back home. That brings us, naturally, to the open scholarly debate. Can a war exist if one side doesn't even know it's happening? International law typically requires mutual recognition of hostilities, even if only symbolic. But the Dutch didn't fire a single shot, and the Scillies didn't raise a flag in defiance. So, was this truly a war or merely a diplomatic exclamation point, forgotten the moment it was spoken? Some legal scholars argue that a unilateral declaration can count as war, especially if it's issued by a recognized naval authority. Others argue that without engagement, without correspondence, confrontation, or consequence, it's little more than a rhetorical flourish. You imagine now the villagers in 1651, busy tending sheep and drying cod, completely unaware that across the water they were now enemies of the Dutch Republic. You pass a stone marker half buried in grass, engraved with nothing but a year, 1651. Whether it refers to the war or something far more mundane, perhaps the date a cottage was built, you'll never know. But in this landscape, everything, it feels like a quiet nod to forgotten pages. You head inland now, past mossy walls and low hedges. The island is no more than a few square miles wide, and even today it's sparsely populated. Most people here seem to have made peace long before any ambassador ever arrived. Their war memorials are for other wars, the real ones. The ones that shook the world. World War I, World War II, but not this. Not the war with no battles, no uniforms, and no good reason. And here's a delightful twist. In 2021, the 335th anniversary of the war's alleged start passed by with barely a whisper. No parades, no wreaths, just the steady hum of ferry engines and the occasional tourist asking, "Wait, we were at war with the Dutch." You chuckle to yourself. Even today, the story remains a kind of inside joke among locals, a historical footnote with its own sense of humor. At a nearby pub, a chalkboard menu offers peace ale declared smooth since 1986. You have to admire the commitment. You stop at a hilltop, where a small plaque overlooks the ocean. It doesn't mention the war. Instead, it commemorates a weather station established in the 1800s. Even here, Even now, the history of the forgotten war has been politely nudged aside by more practical concerns: barometric pressure, wind speed, and rainfall averages. You imagine a Dutch historian arriving, scrolling through their notes and realizing once again that there's nothing to see here, and that's the point. The lack of visible conflict, the complete absence of war markers, is what makes the Isles of Scilly the strangest theater of war in European history. You descend from the hill as evening sets in, casting a golden light over the sea. A dog barks in the distance. Somewhere a ferry horn sounds, and you realize this entire island chain has, for centuries, modeled a kind of passive resistance that would make even the most hardened diplomat smile. It was involved in a war by accident. It ended that war with hospitality, and it remembers it today not with monuments, but with gentle laughter and historical curiosity. There's something beautiful about that, something reassuring. Not all conflict leaves scars, some just leave stories. The ambassador who ended a phantom war. You find yourself walking through a narrow lane flanked by whitewashed stone cottages, their windowsills adorned with little blue flower pots and hand-painted house names like Tides, Whisper, and the Gentle Breeze. It feels like the sort of place where nothing dramatic has ever happened, and, indeed, that's part of the joke. Yet, in 1986, this quiet island town received an official diplomatic visit that technically ended the longest-running war in European history. No parades, no flashing cameras, no urgent cables, just a Dutch diplomat, a folder, and a bemused town council. That's where you are now, retracing the steps of the man who closed a 335-year-old chapter with the calm professionalism of someone confirming a lost library book. The mainstream historical fact here is this. In April of 1986, Reinhard, the Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom, visited the Isles of Scilly to officially sign a peace treaty. The conflict, supposedly declared in 1651, had never been acknowledged or resolved. The discovery of this ongoing war had been made by historian and council chairman Roy Duncan, who'd stumbled across a curious reference and decided to investigate further. When he realized that no treaty had ever been signed to conclude the conflict, he contacted the Dutch embassy out of what he later described as mild historical embarrassment. To his surprise, the Dutch responded not with confusion, but with good humor and curiosity. Which leads us to the fringe fact. The 1986 ceremony wasn't even considered particularly newsworthy by most global outlets. Some regional newspapers ran small stories, quirky tales for the back pages. The ceremony itself was held in the modest council chambers of St. Mary's, with a crowd made up of local dignitaries, island residents, and a handful of children who were mostly excited about missing part of the school day. There were no flags draped over tables, no signing pens carved from oak or dipped in ceremonial ink. The treaty was typed on simple paper, bearing a formal yet friendly tone, and included language that all but winked at the historical absurdity of the moment. One line even referenced the long-standing absence of hostility, a bureaucratic way of saying, "We forgot this was even a thing." Ambassador Udekoper, dressed in a suit more appropriate for afternoon tea than high diplomacy, signed the document with a smile and a shrug. There was laughter, a few photographs, and then it was done. A war that no one had fought was finally brought to its polite, dignified end. And here's the scholarly debate. Some legal historians wonder if such symbolic treaties carry any actual legal significance, especially in cases where the original declaration is undocumented or verbal. The Dutch claim to have no record of Trump's declaration of war in 1651. In the absence of formal records, can a peace treaty hold any weight? Or was this entire event just a charming performance to satisfy historical curiosity? Opinions remain split. Some argue that peace declarations matter, even when the war in question was theoretical. Others see the treaty as more ceremonial than meaningful, more pageantry than policy. Still, there's something undeniably poetic about ending a war with smiles and tea. As you pass the little stone building where the ceremony took place, you can almost hear the murmurs of that day. Someone offering biscuits, the ambassador chuckling as he hands over the signed paper, children shifting in their seats, unsure what any of this means. It's a scene that feels more like a village play than an international resolution. But that's precisely what makes it so enduring, because sometimes peace doesn't come with banners or trumpets. Sometimes it arrives with a handshake and an inside joke. Outside the council building there's a small plaque now. It reads, "Peace declared. The Dutch ambassador visited in 1986 to formally end the war with the Isles of Scilly." No shots were fired, no casualties reported. Tea was served. You linger for a moment, taking it in. The simplicity of it. The strange satisfaction of bureaucratic closure. Hundreds of years overdue. Then you keep walking, and the soft clink of a cafe door closing behind someone reminds you that life on the Scillies is rarely interrupted Devon by international diplomacy. Down the lane, you pass a shop window where a postcard reads, "Come for the beaches, stay for the peace treaties." It's cheeky, of course, but also oddly accurate. The war may have been forgotten for centuries, but its ending turned into a kind of cultural wink, a tiny, delightful reason to remember that. Not all conflicts are tragic, some are just weird, and wonderfully so. It makes you wonder how many other forgotten declarations are floating out there in the dusty margins of history, waiting to be discovered by an overly curious town council chair. You pause at a harbor railing and look out over the water, imagining the Dutch fleet once hovering on the horizon, not launching an attack, not issuing demands, just floating there in historical ambiguity. And you realize the real gift of this story isn't just that it's funny or unusual. It's that it reminds us of the power of stories to bridge time. A war that wasn't fought, a peace that wasn't needed. And yet, here you are, retracing every step in a world often driven by conflict. It's oddly comforting to reflect on a war that ended with no damage done. No sides harmed, no scars left behind, just a few amused officials and a bit more peace than there was the day before. How the treaty became a tourism gem. You're wandering through a tiny gift shop now. One of those converted old cottages where the wooden floorboards creak just enough to make you feel like you've stepped into a story. Everything smells faintly of salt air and paperbacks. On the left, there's a shelf packed with local history books, some with dramatic titles, some with whimsical ones like The War That Nobody Fought. You pick one up and flip through the pages. There it is, again, the 335-year war between the Dutch and the Isles of Scilly, complete with smiling ambassadors, forgotten records and polite British weather. But this time, something new catches your eye, a rack of postcards depicting Admiral Trump with a cartoon speech bubble. Wait, we're still at war? Welcome to the strangest twist in the whole tale. The war has become one of the Isles of Scilly's most quietly successful tourist attractions. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. The Isles have leaned gently into their accidental claim to fame without needing to fabricate anything or build flashy monuments. The locals have embraced their bizarre diplomatic blip with a kind of charming dry humor. You'll find mugs that say "Make peace, not paperwork," bookmarks with treaty dates printed on them, and yes, guided walking tours that pass by the exact building where the ambassador signed that delightfully unnecessary treaty in 1986. And here's your fringe fact. The story has actually drawn international interest, especially among people who adore the obscure and delightfully weird. Journalists from Dutch newspapers have come to do soft profile pieces. Dutch tourists come just to stand where their invincible 17th century fleet once loomed in silence. One visitor in 2014 brought a homemade Dutch flag and took selfies around the harbor, laughing that they were checking in on the longest layover in naval history. Some Cylonians have even joked that the Dutch should re-invade for the sake of tourism, though only if they bring good cheese and better weather. All of this leads into the current scholarly debate. Should the intersection of historical curiosity and local economics be treated with more academic scrutiny? In simpler terms, when a silly unresolved story like this becomes a moneymaker, does that shape the way we tell the tale? Is history being diluted into a punchline? Some academics argue that these kinds of micro-histories deserve deeper exploration, that they reveal overlooked patterns in diplomatic communication, legal ambiguity, and the psychology of conflict. Others say, it's just a good yarn. You glance up at the shopkeeper now, who's quietly rearranging a display of tea towels featuring treaty quotes like "better late than never." She catches your eye and smiles, then nods toward a display basket labeled "War-free since '86. It holds small jars of locally made jam. Of course it does. You leave the shop and walk toward the harbor again, where a large laminated sign now displays a short summary of the 335-year war. Its position just beside the ferry terminal, as if to give arriving visitors a quick introduction to why everyone here seems unusually amused by international relations. It begins with the line, "In 1651, war was declared. Then, everyone forgot." Not quite accurate, but close enough. You follow a tour group led by a cheerful local guide, wearing a yellow raincoat. She's explaining how the Isles were a royalist refuge during the English Civil War, and how Trump showed up with his fleet, annoyed at the lack of Dutch shipping security. A boy in the back raises his hand and asks, "But did he actually say the words 'I declare war'?" The guide grins and shrugs, replying, "That's the mystery, isn't it?" You trail behind the group as they wind through narrow lanes. One woman whispers to her partner, Imagine if all wars were this polite. It's not a bad thought. You pass a pub named the Diplomat's Pint with a chalkboard offering Dutch courage stew and royalist roast. You can't tell how much of it is tongue-in-cheek, but you suspect the entire island runs on some combination of local pride and well-edged irony. At another shop, you see t-shirts printed with a tiny map of the Isles and the slogan, "We survived the quietest war in history." You chuckle to yourself. Somewhere along the way, the treaty that was forgotten has turned into a gentle pillar of identity. Silly doesn't just wear its history, it winks at it. And why shouldn't it? In a world often overwhelmed by conflict and tension, the idea of a war that caused no bloodshed, no destruction, and ended centuries later with mutual chuckles, well, that's a history worth telling, and retelling, and maybe embroidering on a decorative pillow. As the sun begins to lower over the sea, casting a soft orange glow across the water, you take one last look at the harbor and imagine that Dutch fleet in 1651, floating in silence, wondering if their stern message would ever reach anyone. Didn't, but it did leave behind something just as powerful. A story that today sells jam prints postcards, and maybe, just maybe, offers a little hope about how conflicts might end in laughter instead of loss. You walk on, the ocean breeze at your back and the scent of distant chips wafting from a seaside shop. It's history, served with a side of sarcasm and wrapped in a timeline that forgot to tick. The historians who couldn't agree are seated now in the tiny local archive of St. Mary's, fingers tracing the cracked leather spines of dusty ledgers and history books that haven't been checked out in decades. There's a whir of a ceiling fan overhead, an electric kettle burbling quietly nearby, and the faint scent of old paper mixed with tea bags. The room feels like a time capsule, and not just because of its contents. You're here chasing ghosts specifically, the trail of scholarly opinions that have tried, and mostly failed, to pin down the exact nature of the 335-year war. And right away, you discover that historians haven't quite agreed on whether it even happened the way it's now told. That brings us to our mainstream historical fact. There is no surviving formal documentation from Admiral Martin Tromp, himself explicitly stating he declared war on the Isles of Scilly in 1651. The earliest mention of this peculiar conflict actually comes much later from a 19th century historian who was collecting maritime legends. According to that source, the war had been declared verbally during the 10th standoff between the Dutch Navy and the Royalist outpost in Scilly. But if you were hoping for a parchment scroll stamped with wax and written in flowery Dutch legalese, you'll be sorely disappointed. Which leads us neatly into the fringe fact. One of the most cited documents referencing the war was written over 200 years after the supposed declaration. It wasn't a government record, but rather a quirky local footnote in a book about British naval oddities. And yet, this slim slice of anecdote is what prompted Roy Duncan in the 1980s to dig deeper. Some of the archive's older index cards still list Scilly Dutch War, alleged as if it were a prank somebody forgot to delete from the system. More than one historian has since compared the whole affair to a long-running inside joke too amusing to disprove, too vague to fully confirm. But the open scholarly debate here runs deeper. What is a threshold for recognizing an act of war? Must there be physical violence? Must both sides acknowledge it? Does intent matter more than execution? Some legal scholars argue that even an unofficial or poorly recorded declaration, if made by a legitimate authority, still constitutes an act of war. Others say war must result in political or human consequences, otherwise it's just theater. This leads to more head-scratching. If Tromp declared war on Scilly, but Scilly never responded, is that a war, a monologue? And if no one died, no ships were damaged, and no property was harmed, can the word war really apply? You flip open a folder labeled Scilly Treaty Inquiry and find a letter exchange between Roy Duncan and a Dutch embassy clerk from 1985. The tone is cheerful, even bemused. The clerk writes, "We appreciate your island's good humor regarding this very long diplomatic oversight. We agree it's probably time to sign something." And just like that, a centuries-old war was given new life, not through historical urgency, but through shared amusement. You imagine the historians now some shaking their heads in dismay that such a poorly sourced story has gained such traction. Others embracing it as the perfect case study in how legend and truth twist around each other like vines. One Cambridge professor reportedly gave a whole seminar titled, "The Imagined Conflict, Historiography and Humor in Naval Memory." You wish you could have attended that one, because in the margins of serious history, the 335-year war has become an unexpected celebrity. You lean back now, listening to the tick of a war clock and the gentle hum of the archive. You think about how much of history is built not on battles but on paperwork or the lack of it, a forgotten declaration, a misfiled letter, a war that lives on in souvenirs and scholarly smirks. And yet, it matters. It teaches something, not just about diplomacy or the messiness of record-keeping, but about how humans process conflict. Sometimes we fight, yes, but sometimes we forget. And sometimes we laugh. You pull out a notebook and begin sketching a timeline. 1651 Trump shows up, gets annoyed. 1652 Dutch return home. 1800s historian writes quirky footnote. 1985 local councilman says, wait a minute. 1986 tea, handshake, peace. You underline the last part twice. It feels oddly satisfying, not because it's dramatic, but because it isn't. Not because it changed the world, but because it quietly didn't. You close the folder and leave. The archive, stepping out into the Cylonian sun once more. The harbor is just as peaceful as ever. A small ferry glides across the water, its wake parting the sea like a polite whisper. A couple sits on a bench feeding seagulls, unaware that the very ground beneath their feet was once the theoretical front line of a war. You pass a chalkboard that reads, Today's History Walk, the war with no war. It's starting in 10 minutes and it includes a complimentary shortbread. You decide to go. Why not? After all, the best kind of history doesn't shout, it lingers, quietly, like the echo of a war everyone forgot to fight, and nobody remembered to end until they did. Of T.I. treaties, and tourist Talasiov joined the history walk now, strolling behind a cheerful guide in a sun hat who's wielding a laminated folder and a well-worn sense of comic timing. The small group around you shuffles along the harbor path, shoes crunching lightly on the gravel as seagulls wheel overhead like curious squawking narrators. She pauses under a crooked old lamppost and gestures to a bench, grinning. Right. This very spot, some say, was where the ambassador may or may not have sat after ending the war. Possibly, or maybe he just needed a rest. The group chuckles. The walk is equal parts history, folklore, and good-natured shrugging. And that's kind of the point. You're now witnessing how this war, if you can even call it that, has become more than just a quirky anecdote. It's become a story. The island tells about itself, a local legend polished by retellings and softened by time. That's our mainstream historical fact. In the decades since the 1986 peace treaty, the Isles of Scilly have carefully woven this unusual diplomatic footnote into their modern identity, not by overplaying it, but by allowing its oddness to sit gently alongside the seascapes, lighthouses, and tales of shipwrecks. The peace treaty is mentioned in nearly every guidebook, occasionally printed on menus, and retold with such effortless charm that few visitors ever question its logic. It's a story without drama, without villains, without loss, and in that simplicity lies its strength. Which leads us to our fringe fact. There was, briefly, a campaign in the early 1990s to turn the event into an annual local holiday. The proposal included ideas like a treaty tea day, complete with Dutch cheese tastings, reenactments of the ambassador's visit, and maybe even a fake cannon salute from a nearby fishing boat. The plan never quite materialized, probably because it was a bit too tongue-in-cheek even for the Cylonians. But the idea still surfaces now and again at council meetings, usually followed by laughter, and here comes your scholarly debate. Should history be celebrated for its factual accuracy, or for the way it helps a community shape its narrative? Historians argue over the legitimacy of the war itself, but sociologists are often more interested in the way the Isles embrace the tale. When a story, no matter how absurd, becomes part of how people define where they're from, does it need to be perfectly true, or is it enough that it's meaningful? One academic from the University of Exeter even suggested that the war is a kind of cultural placeholder, an empty conflict filled later by meaning, a ritualized non-event, a memory scaffolded on ambiguity. But perhaps the most charming argument came from an elderly islander who once told a reporter, well, if it wasn't true, it should have been. The group moves again, weaving past a tea shop called the Ceasefire Calf, its windows painted with pastel flags and faux parchment scrolls. You duck inside for a moment and find yourself standing before a display of commemorative coasters that read, Peace since '86, no shots, just scones. The air smells of clotted cream and cinnamon. The woman behind the counter leans over and says, oh, you're with the walk, aren't you? You'll be wanting the treaty cake, vanilla sponge, Dutch cocoa drizzle. You buy a slice, obviously back outside. The guide is explaining how the actual treaty document, typed, signed, and sealed, was framed and now hangs inside the island council chambers, beside a much older map of the Isles marked with Dutch naval routes. She smiles knowingly and says, and just for the record, the ambassador did have tea afterward, we think. A boy in the group raises his hand and asks, did they have fireworks? The guide considers this. No fireworks, she says. But someone definitely clapped. There's a pause, then laughter, and you realize something else now. The treaty, the war, the forgotten declaration, it's not just a curiosity. It's a ritual, a comforting rhythm in the island's collective memory. The war that never happened became the peace that everyone remembers. As the walk ends and the group begins to disperse, the guide hands you a leaflet. Fun fact, she says. Some Dutch tourists once asked if they could reinvade and reenact the whole Thinkenoes flags, the lot. We said sure, as long as they booked ahead. More laughter, but there's real affection in her voice. You walk a bit further down to the jetty, where waves lap quietly at the stone steps. A breeze picks up and you notice a plaque affixed to a low wall nearby. It reads, "Here stood two nations, one confused, one amused. Peace, in the end, was inevitable." You smile. The line might be poetic license, but somehow it feels entirely appropriate. You sit on a low bench, enjoying the quiet view and the remaining crumbs of treaty cake. Around you, nothing shouts for attention. No museum displays with dramatic lighting. No statues with swords raised aloftest. The gentle murmur of a place that remembered something funny and made it matter. The sea rolls in and out, unchanged by centuries of silent diplomacy. And you think again about how this odd tale has grown roots here, not just in documents, but in flour-dusted bakeries, laminated tour scripts and jokes told over sandwiches. A war with no fire and a treaty signed with smiles. It shouldn't, but it is, because sometimes history whispers rather than roars. And sometimes it brings cake. The world finds out too late. Timoteo sitting now in a modest seaside inn, a cup of lukewarm tea at your elbow and a copy of the Times folded open to an article headlined, "World's Longest War Ends Without a Single Shot." It's from 1986, and the edges are yellowing with time. The paper's slightly crinkled as though it had been read and reread, perhaps by someone who still wasn't sure if the entire thing was satire. Because here's what happened. Once the treaty was finally signed between the Dutch ambassador and the Isles of Scilly, the story exploded, but in the gentlest, most British way possible. This, then, is your mainstream historical fact. News of the bizarre war that wasn't made the rounds in 1986 through UK papers, European columns, and even a few international headlines. There was a ripple of interest, brief and amused, and most journalists treated the whole affair as an endearing example of bureaucratic oblivion wrapped in diplomatic politeness. What surprised people wasn't just that the war had technically lasted 335 years, but that nobody had noticed, cared, or been harmed. If history had a snooze button, this was it. One BBC commentator joked, "Britain's bloodiest war may be the War of the Roses." Its driest, however, just ended. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Following the press coverage, a few historical reenactment societies reached out to the Scilly Isles Council to ask if they could restage the declaration of war using full 17th century hats with feathers and properly grim scowls. The council politely declined, citing excessive whimsy, but they did approve a small exhibition at the local maritime museum, which included a replica of the treaty, a plastic quill pen, and a little cardboard sign that read, "Longest peace ever." Which brings us to the open scholarly debate. When forgotten treaties and accidental wars resurface centuries later, how should modern historians treat them? Some argue this was just a curiosity, a cute historical footnote best left to trivia nights and pub conversations. Others believe it raises deeper questions about how historical memory is formed, and how easily it can be lost. Should we mourn the loss of original documentation? Should we push for more thorough historical audits of forgotten conflicts? Or is this kind of event precisely the charm of history, that it occasionally misfires, forgets itself, and reappears, like a lost sock in a drawer you haven't opened in years? As you read more clippings, you find international responses. Dutch papers treated the affair with a dry chuckle, noting that Admiral Tromp was now finally relieved of his longest command. A small Spanish publication speculated, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, that other such phantom wars might still be quietly unresolved around the globe, ticking away like forgotten alarms. Some archivists even started casually combing through naval records, hoping to find their own sleepy conflicts. You smile as you come across a letter to the editor, dated 1987, where someone in Cornwall suggests that maybe they've been at war with Devon since the 1400s, purely out of habit. It's all so wonderfully British, understated, bemused, and perpetually in need of tea. But even amid the light-heartedness, something deeper lingers. There's a lesson here, tucked beneath the giggles and the scones, that peace, however absurdly late, can still be made, and that wars don't always need to end in treaties carved in marble or banners waving over rubble. Sometimes they end with a handshake, a printed leaflet, and a smiling man in a blazer saying, "We forgive you." You picture the 1986 ceremony. Again, a few chairs set up on a patch of Cylonian grass. A Dutch diplomat trying not to laugh. Roy Duncan proudly presenting a typed agreement. There were no drums, no cameras from major networks, just the sound of seagulls and the rustle of official paper, freshly printed for a war that nobody remembered starting. You finish your tea, which is now cold, and look out the window. The sea is silver under the twilight sky, and a fishing boat hums quietly toward the dock. You wonder what the sailors aboard would say if you asked them about the treaty. Most likely they'd shrug and say, "Ah yes, the Dutch thing. Bit daft, wasn't it?" You step outside and walk toward the Maritime Museum. It's closed for the evening, but through the glass you can just make out the treaty exhibit, tiddy, modest, unpretentious, like the treaty itself. There's no dramatic lighting, no velvet ropes, just a printout under glass, a smiling photograph of the signatories, and a laminated fact sheet that ends with, "Declared in 1651, ended in 1986, no known casualties, save for some paperwork." And that, right there, is the legacy. Not cannon fire, not treaties carved into stone. Just a story rediscovered long after it mattered. And yet, somehow, just in time, as you walk back along the harbor, you hear a teenager say to his friend, "Did you know we were technically at war for over 300 years? His friend responds, "With who?" The boy shrugs, "Don't remember, but we won." You smile to yourself. Somewhere Admiral Trump might be chuckling too. When bureaucracy becomes history's comedian, you find yourself now in the quiet reading room of a regional library, one that claims, perhaps a bit too eagerly, to be home of the best microfilm archive in the Southwest. The librarian gives you a sympathetic smile as you flip through rolls of tiny, ghost-like print, chasing old government memos and council minutes with a sort of determination, usually reserved for gold hunters or crossword enthusiasts. And what you're searching for, oddly enough, is bureaucracy, specifically how the machinery of paperwork accidentally let an entire war linger for centuries like a forgotten office plant. This is your mainstream historical fact. After the 1651 declaration, no follow-up documentation was ever produced to end the supposed conflict. No letter of truce, no conditional peace, no reminder post-it from the king's office. And in the centuries that followed, not one official department, either Dutch or British, ever got around to officially acknowledging or dismissing the status of war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. The gears of empire rolled on, indifferent. There were bigger fish to fry, like the Napoleonic Wars, or tea taxes, or Napoleon himself escaping from Elba. The Isles of Scilly didn't even appear on most foreign maps, and when they did, it was with the same visual priority as an ornamental shrub, which makes the entire 335-year conflict less a matter of military strategy and more a bizarre clerical oversight. This is where we turn to our fringe fact. In 1990, a group of university students from Utrecht decided to stage a mock trial on campus, putting the Dutch Republic on trial for failing to follow through on its declaration of war, complete with powdered wigs, hand-drawn flags, and legal jargon that teetered between scholarly and absurd. The event ended with a unanimous mock verdict. Negligent, but endearingly so. The student who played the ambassador reportedly brought cake, which brings us to the open scholarly debate. How much of history is shaped by the things we forget to do? Most formal histories emphasize action, treaties signed, wars fought, borders drawn. But events like the 335-year war flip that script entirely. What if the real story is in the inaction, the silence, the dusty shelves no one ever dusted? Some historians argue that this story is not an anomaly, but a mirror of how fragile official memory truly is. Treaties can be misfiled, declarations can be verbal, and entire geopolitical statuses can be left unresolved, sometimes for centuries, simply because no one remembered to check. The term paper peace has emerged in academic circles to describe such phenomena, where the absence of paperwork is treated as a historical act in itself. You lean back in your chair now, absorbing all of this. It's almost poetic, really. In a world where wars usually begin with a bang, this one started with a sigh. And in a world where most wars end with parades or pages of dense legalese, this one faded into a bureaucratic daydream. You flip to another page, discovering a memorandum from the 1960s in which a naval historian simply wrote, "Silly conflict and clear if real. Recommend TEU underline it." That's the entire war, summed up in 4 words and a beverage. You picture the unnamed clerks over the years who might have stumbled across hints of this war and simply moved on, thinking, Surely someone else has sorted this, but no one ever did. Because sometimes, in the endless churn of empires and ministries and border commissions, the Isles of Scilly just didn't make the cut. They were too small, too quiet, too polite to cause diplomatic friction. And the Dutch, well, they had their own paperwork maelstrom to navigate, including trading, charters, colony records, and requests from distant governors who were mostly just trying to keep their ships afloat and their wigs dry. As the sun dips lower outside the library window, you imagine a ghostly version of this entire tale being acted out in slow motion across the centuries. A Dutch admiral declaring war to no audience, a British scribe filing the wrong paper, a Cylonian fisherman shrugging and returning to his net. Over and over, history decided not to care. And in that collective shrug, the war lived on not because anyone believed in it, but because no one remembered to end it. You close the microfilm, reel and stand, stretching. Your brain is now stuffed full of accidental diplomacy and passive-aggressive archival behavior. But more than that, you feel an odd sense of peace. Because in some strange way, this war, this quiet, ridiculous, wonderfully pointless war proves something vital. That not everything in history has to matter to everyone, but everything in history does matter to someone. Whether it's Roy Duncan with his council pen and stubborn curiosity, or a librarian who laminated a forgotten article, or a sleepy student reenacting naval diplomacy for laughs, someone carried the story forward, and in doing so, turned it from a clerical error into a cultural gem. You leave the library with a photocopy tucked under your arm and a new appreciation for how history often walks instead of runs, how it mumbles instead of shouts. A small plaque on the library wall reads, "Silence is not the absence of history. It is sometimes the history itself." You nod and walk out into the growing dusk. The ambassador with a sense of humor. The clouds hang low today, painted in wide streaks of pewter over the calm sea. You're seated at a small wooden table inside the Isles of Scilly Council building, sipping mediocre coffee out of a chipped mug that reads official business. Across from you is a laminated photograph of the man who made it official, Reinheidkoper, the Dutch ambassador who signed the treaty in 1986. His tie is slightly askew. His smile is half curious, half bemused, and the caption underneath reads simply, "The ambassador who ended the war." And it's true he did, but not with grand speeches or ceremonial cannons. No, Heidkoper did it with a good suit, a decent pen, and an almost saintly level of patience for British small talk. Your mainstream historical fact today is this. In April 1986, Dutch Ambassador Reinheidkoper formally visited the Isles of Scilly at the request of local historian Roy Duncan to sign a peace treaty that would, at long last, officially end the 335-year-long war that had, by all accounts, consisted of 0 battles, 0 threats, and 0 awareness from 99.9% of the global population. The event was attended by island officials, a few curious reporters, and several amused residents who, up until then, hadn't realized they were technically living in a war zone. The fringe fact: Heidkoper brought gifts. According to one islander, who witnessed the occasion, the ambassador brought along Dutch cheese, a tin of stroopwafels, and a bottle of Geneva Dutch gin. Whether these were official diplomatic offerings or just a thoughtful touch remains unclear, but the gesture was appreciated. It turns out that peace and mild confusion goes down easier with snacks. And here's your scholarly debate. Why did the Netherlands even agree to participate in this ceremony? Was it out of diplomatic courtesy, historical curiosity, or just a delightful opportunity for low-stakes international goodwill? Some scholars argue that this kind of soft diplomacy plays a subtle but powerful role in how nations maintain relationships. Others point out that the entire event was symbolic theater, feel-good photo op with no legal consequence, but perhaps it was both. After all, history is full of conflicts that never really end, lingering borders, unsaid resentments, footnotes that fester, but here was one that could be tied off neatly, with smiles and paperwork and cheese. That's rare. Heidkoper later reflected on the moment with a kind of dry fondness, calling it the most peaceful negotiation of my career. He joked to the press afterward that his only regret was that the war didn't involve more elaborate uniforms. The treaty itself was typed up, signed by both parties, and quickly framed for display, though not before someone scrawled in the margins a note reading, "No compensation requested. We forgive you." You stare at the photo again, this time focusing on the other people in the background. There's Roy Duncan, practically glowing with quiet triumph. There's a local councillor squinting at the paperwork like he's not entirely convinced it's necessary. And there's a child peeking over a windowsill, barely visible, as if to say, "What's going on in there?" The scene is utterly unremarkable and somehow profound. You imagine being in the room that day, standing beside the sea-chipped walls, listening to chairs scrape against the floor, and watching two men from different countries shake hands over something no one could truly remember. It's the kind of moment that wouldn't even make the second page of the newspaper, but would live forever in someone's memory as the day war turned to laughter. Later, you walk down to the council chambers, where a framed copy of the treaty still hangs, beside a map of the Isles and a small brass plaque. It reads, "In this room, peace was finally declared after 335 years. It took 10 minutes and one really good pen." You chuckle. Then, something catches your eye. Tucked into the frame, nearly invisible unless you're looking for it, is a faded envelope. It contains a thank you letter, handwritten by Hydecoper, thanking the Isles for their hospitality. The letter closes with a single line: "Should you ever find another forgotten war, do let us know. I would be honored to help end that one too." You walk back out into the sunlight, marveling at the simplicity of it all. No drama, no ceremony, just two humans doing what humans do best when given the chance, talking, listening, laughing, and deciding, without fuss, to be done with conflict. The breeze carries the scent of salt and baked goods as you head into the village center. A cafe has placed a sandwich board out front. Today's special piece, pudding and Dutch hot chocolate. You don't even hesitate. You sit, you order, and you wonder how many wars could have been avoided if dessert had always come first. A war memorial with nothing to remember. You find yourself now standing on the green just outside the small town hall of Hewtown, the largest settlement in the Isles of Scilly, which admittedly still feels more like a friendly village with excellent schoon distribution than anything you'd label urban. The grass is freshly cut, the benches face the sea, and the seagulls are politely aggressive. In front of you, tucked between a notice board about recycling hours and a local walking tour schedule, is something that almost resembles a war memorial. But this one's different. This one is for a war with no battles, no generals, and not even a proper beginning. And so it is, with some irony, that we enter this moment with our mainstream historical fact. Following the 1986 treaty, local authorities on Scilly commissioned a modest plaque commemorating the official end of the conflict with the Netherlands. It wasn't marble. There was no statue of Admiral Tromp riding a cannonball. It was just a neatly polished rectangle of stone fixed onto the outer wall of the town hall. The inscription, as you lean in to read it, says, "Peace declared between the Isles of Scilly and the Kingdom of the Netherlands, April 17, 1986, 335 years of friendly hostility." There's a little flourish at the bottom, a cartoon cannon with a flower growing from its barrel. It's a memorial with absolutely nothing grim to memorialize, and somehow, that makes it more profound. The quirky fact here is that several locals took it upon themselves to hold a yearly peace picnic after the treaty. According to archived council newsletters and one local blog from the early 2000s titled "Silly Me Softly," island residents would gather with Dutch flags, orange-themed snacks, and at least one person in a fake admiral's hat toasting the end of the world's gentlest conflict. There were no speeches, only biscuits, no national anthems, only ukuleles. One year a bakery sold treaty tarts with tiny icing doves. It's possibly the only war commemoration in the world where the post-conflict ritual involves humming sea shanties and politely declining extra clotted cream. And now we meet our scholarly debate. How should memory be preserved for historical events that are significant not because of tragedy or impact, but because of their sheer absurdity? Some historians argue that such events, while charming, distract from more urgent histories, but others fiercely defend their importance, arguing that these stories highlight the often overlooked fact that not all human conflict needs to be dramatic or devastating to deserve remembrance. The Treaty of 1986 and its peculiar origins have become a cornerstone example in academic discussions about negative history, that is, events remembered for what didn't happen rather than what did. The argument that peace, especially when accidental and quiet, deserves its monuments too. You sit on a bench nearby watching a few tourists take photos of the plaque. One couple seems amused, the other confused. A young boy, probably no older than 10, is explaining the war to his sister, and he gets about halfway through before giving up entirely and saying, "It was a pretend war, but for real." That about sums it up. You start to imagine what a proper memorial for the 335-year war would look like if it were fully realized. Perhaps a museum filled with nothing but blank pages, empty display cases labeled "Nothing Happened Here," and headphones that play the sound of polite Dutch silence. Maybe a life-sized statue of Roy Duncan holding a clipboard and trying very hard to look serious while giggling inside. Or maybe it's this bench, this plaque, and the stories that people now pass along over coffee and crab sandwiches. That's the real monument, the retelling, the narrative where the conflict is in the forgetting, and the resolution is in the rediscovery. You walk down the road a little ways and find a souvenir shop with a surprising amount of treaty merchandise. There are fridge magnets shaped like scrolls, mugs with the year 1651 to 1986 printed in phobic fonts, and even a t-shirt that reads, "I survived the silly war barely." It's all done with the same tongue-in-cheek reverence that you've seen throughout the aisles. History treated not as a burden, but as a pleasant, eccentric relative who tells the same story every Christmas. You buy a magnet, and as you hand over your coins, the shopkeeper winks and says, "Be careful, we haven't declared peace with France yet." You laugh, but also take a moment to wonder if anyone has double-checked that. On your way back to the harbor, you see a group of schoolchildren gathered around the plaque. Their teacher is telling the story of the war, and she finishes with, "And so they signed a peace, and nobody was hurt, and everyone went home happy." A small girl raises her hand and asks, "Why didn't they just talk to each other in the first place?" The teacher pauses, smiles, and says, "Because history forgets things, and sometimes we have to remind it." You pause and stare at the waves. A breeze picks up salted memory in the air. The sea, as always, knows nothing of paperwork or treaties. But somewhere, deep in the fog of time and oversight, two nations managed to laugh their way out of a war they forgot they were. And that's something worth remembering. The day history side in relief here. Now walking along the narrow pebbled path that skirts the edge of the harbor. The sun is dipping low behind the waves, casting the boats in a wash of warm amber, and every footstep crunches with that, a soft, lazy rhythm that only small sea-bound towns seem to possess. The air smells of kelp and toast. It's the kind of place where you half expect time to pause and ask if you're enjoying yourself. And as you walk, your mind turns to that final moment, the one where, after centuries of silence, two hands reached across a table and signed a piece of paper that finally put the whole charade to rest. And yes, that's your mainstream historical fact. On April 17, 1986, the Dutch ambassador Rein Heidkoper and Isles of Scilly Council Chairman Roy Duncan signed the document officially ending the war. The treaty itself is short-lived, so there was no need for pages of fine print, no territorial adjustments, no reparations or reconciliation clauses, just two sentences affirming that peace now officially exists where war technically once had. It might have taken 335 years to get there, but it was done in less than 10 minutes. And with a smile, and the quirky fact. Well, it turns out that the pen used to sign the treaty was borrowed last minute from a local teacher who had popped in to check on a council bulletin. The teacher, unaware of the historic nature of the moment, was more concerned about getting the pen back before her next lesson. It was a green plastic biro, slightly chewed on one end. Later she told her students, "You never know when your pen might end a war." The story's been confirmed by two sources, a newspaper clipping and the pen itself, which now sits encased in a glass box in the town archives, labeled Instrument of Peace with slight bite marks. And now for the open scholarly debate. What is the long-term value of ceremonial acts that serve no real geopolitical function? Skeptics argue that these events are little more than symbolic pantomimes, existing to amuse, not inform. But many cultural historians point out that symbolism is often the bridge between forgetfulness and memory. By publicly ending the war even, one so ludicrously irrelevant as these communities were given a shared narrative, a story they could claim as uniquely theirs, a mythology of peace. And in a century shadowed by actual wars, refugee crises and nuclear fear, such narratives offer a soothing counterbalance. They remind us of what it looks like when conflict quietly evaporates rather than explodes. When diplomacy isn't a performance, but a shrug and a handshake. You stop at the edge of the quay, watching as a ferry pulls in, tourists leaning against the rail, cameras ready. They don't know it yet, but soon they'll hear about the war that wasn't, the admiral who never fired a shot, the treaty born of curiosity and quirk, and maybe they'll laugh, or maybe they'll pause, just for a moment, and wonder how many forgotten wars still float through history like untethered balloons, waiting for someone with a clipboard and a sense of humor to tie them down. As the boat docks, you glance up and spot a painted sign hanging from a nearby pub. It reads the Peace Treaty, a name adopted not long after 1986. Inside, a chalkboard lists today's offerings: treaty ale, Dutch stew, and something called forgotten war fries. You order all three. The bartender, a man with a face like he's been storing secrets in his cheeks for 50 years, nods approvingly. "Good choice," he says. Nothing like peas and potatoes. As you eat, you hear a conversation from the next table. A couple is reading the back of a tourist brochure, and the woman says, "So, did anyone even notice they were at war?" The man replies, "I guess not. But that's the point. It still counted." And he's right, because even the things we forget count, especially when they come back to remind us how silly we can be. You finish your meal and wander out into the twilight, the ferry horn echoing behind you, the village settling into its evening lull, and you think somewhere out there, in a box, in a drawer, maybe another treaty waits. Another silly war no one remembers. And maybe another Roy Duncan, or another curious librarian, will stumble across it. Maybe they'll make a call, right? A letter, ask a question no one's thought to ask. And maybe, if we're lucky, history will sigh again. Not out of frustration, but out of relief. Out of that rare, wonderful moment where it gets to close a file and say, "Ah, that's better." And that, you realize, is what happened here. Not a bang, not a victory. Just a gentle sigh across centuries, finally let out in full. The librarian who found the war. You walk into a modest stone building near the center of Hewtown, one that locals proudly call the Silly Archives. It smells like aging paper, sea-damp jackets, and the faint aroma of someone's overworked electric kettle. Inside, tucked behind a wobbly bookshelf and beneath a skylight that leaks only when it rains sideways, is the room where everything changed, not with battle, but with a binder. This, quite fittingly, is where the war was found, and today's mainstream historical fact. In the 1980s, local historian and archivist Roy Duncan, while sorting through documents for a completely unrelated research project, stumbled across an obscure reference to a 17th century declaration of war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. The detail was brief, almost an afterthought, but it lingered. Unlike most people who would have shrugged and moved on, Duncan became fascinated. Was it just a metaphor, a joke, a misunderstood document? So, he kept digging. His quirky discovery turned into a historical rabbit hole, one that eventually led him to uncover the curious diplomatic limbo in which the two regions had technically remained at war, on paper, for over 3 centuries. The quirky fact: Roy Duncan, known for his meticulous research and terribly dry jokes, reportedly didn't believe it himself at first. According to an interview in a local newsletter, Duncan said, "I assumed it was one of those exaggerated colonial legends, like pirate maps or tax-free smuggling ports, but it kept popping up. And then I thought, well, that's odd." Even adder, his discovery was first shared not in a journal or public lecture, but in the back pages of a gardening magazine he occasionally wrote for. That's right, one of Britain's most quietly absurd historical corrections began in a footnote about soil alkalinity. The scholarly debate, it surrounds Duncan's initial interpretation. Some argue that the declaration of war was more figurative than literal, that Admiral Trump's blockade of Scilly was aimed more at Cornwall generally, and that no real diplomatic paperwork explicitly named the Isles. Others claim that the nature of 17th century warfare meant such nuances weren't necessary for conflict to be legally recognized. The disagreement continues among historians, many of whom now cite the 335-year war as a case study in the murkiness of early modern declarations and the unintended consequences of bureaucratic neglect. You imagine Duncan here, sorting dusty ledgers and sipping weak tea, squinting at brittle parchment and muttering, "This can't be right." You sit at his favorite desk, the wood still marked by decades of elbows and pen scratches. On the wall is a framed printout of the first public mention of the treaty. In that article, Duncan ends with a line, "Should the Dutch wish to end hostilities, I suspect we'd welcome them with pasties and cider." His invitation would of course be accepted. You flip through the archival binder that holds copies of the treaty, the newspaper clippings, and the letters sent to the Dutch Embassy. One, dated March 12, 1985, reads, "Dear Ambassador, I write with a rather unusual historical inquiry, and so began one of the strangest and most delightfully polite diplomatic correspondences of modern history." The Dutch Embassy, to their credit, responded not with dismissal, but with curiosity. According to Duncan's own notes, the phone call was full of polite chuckling and long pauses, then a final, "We'll look into it," and they did. From that moment on, the war went from historical oddity to international curiosity. The media got involved, mildly amused. Academics took notes. Local school children were made to reenact a war by standing very still for several minutes and then walking away. It became a village event, a quiet celebration of shared discovery. And Duncan, who was amused by it all, his final interviews, before his passing, describe him as deeply pleased that his little oddity had grown into something meaningful, not because of its scale, but because of its absurdity. "The fact that people care," he said, "is what makes it real." You flip through the last pages of the binder, noting one more peculiar item. A photocopy of a thank you card from the Dutch government. It's filled with signatures, a small sketch of a tulip, and a handwritten note reading, "To peace, and those who chase it heaven in the dustiest corners." You close the binder gently. Outside, a bell rings softly as someone enters the library. Maybe another student, maybe another Roy Duncan, maybe someone who, like you, came looking for answers and found instead a story wrapped in quiet charm. The librarian walks past, sees you lingering over the binder and says, "That one gets a lot of love these days. Makes a nice change, doesn't it? A war we can laugh at." You nod. It's rare, after all, to find a moment in history that doesn't ask you to mourn, fear, or judge, but to smile, to marvel, to remember. And that's what Roy Duncan gave the world. A story we forgot, until someone curious enough refused to let it stay forgotten. When the Netherlands said, "Oh really?" you find yourself now mentally drifting over to The Hague, the political heart of the Netherlands. No cobblestones under your feet this time, just the polished tiles of diplomatic offices and the quiet rustle of statue curtains in rooms where serious men and women talk about serious things usually, but not always. Because back in 1985, when Roy Duncan's peculiar letter reached the Dutch embassy, it caused a ripple of mild confusion, followed quickly by one of the rarest sensations in the world of international politics, amusement. And so, we arrive at our mainstream historical fact of the receiving Duncan's inquiry. The Dutch government conducted a formal internal check and, astonishingly, could find no record of peace ever having been declared with the Isles of Scilly. The archives were combed, experts in early modern treaties were consulted, and at every level the verdict came back the same. Legally speaking, a state of war might still exist between them. This was not the sort of discovery a diplomat expects over morning coffee. And yet, there it was, a centuries-old diplomatic shrug still haunting the books. The quirky fact here is that the Dutch ambassador at the time, Reinhard Koper, reportedly laughed out loud when he read the report. In an interview years later, he explained, "It seemed so wonderfully British, accidentally at war for 3 centuries and perfectly content to do nothing about it." So rather than ignore the matter or bury it in legal obscurity, the embassy took a charmingly pragmatic approach. "Let's fix this," they said, and that's where things got even better. Ambassador Heidkoper arranged to visit the Isles of Scilly himself to formally sign a peace treaty, not because he had to, but because, as he later joked, "I didn't want to get blamed for starting another 100 years. And now we come to the open scholarly debate. In a world governed by legal precedent and increasingly dense international treaties, how seriously should we take the symbolic conclusion of a war that lacked every component of actual warfare? Scholars disagree. Some see it as a light-hearted public relations story, one that distracts from real diplomatic labor. Others argue that these seemingly trivial events serve a crucial role, reminding people that international relationships are built not only on conflicts and alliances but also on shared narratives, on moments that reveal the human side of governments. This debate has become a popular case study in international relations courses, especially as discussions around soft diplomacy and the use of cultural engagement continue to grow. Meanwhile, back on the Isles, word of the ambassador's planned visit spread like sea breeze through an open bakery. Locals began preparing their best clothes, tea sets were polished, and flower arrangements considered. One school reportedly held rehearsals for how to say welcome in Dutch, only to abandon the plan after realizing they couldn't find anyone to confirm the pronunciation. When Heidkoper arrived, the ceremony was quaint, respectful, and wonderfully low-key, held in the town hall. It featured a few reporters, a council table freshly cleared of biscuit crumbs, and the presentation of the treaty itself, a document drafted with more sincerity than its topic might suggest. It affirmed peace, expressed goodwill, and declared the centuries-old conflict resolved. The press photos from the event are legendary. 2 men in modest suits shaking hands over a signed piece of paper while a local child watches with the expression of someone who's pretty sure she's missing a math test for this. Afterward, there was a small reception where Heidkoper reportedly enjoyed a Cornish pasty and laughed with islanders about the war. One Cylonian fisherman later recounted, "I told him we'd have one if we'd known it started." Heidkoper responded, "Yes, but we would have surrendered anyway, too polite to fight." And there it was, centuries of accidental tension undone not by negotiation, but by hospitality and mutual appreciation for good pastry. You imagine, In some parallel world, a high-stakes peace talk happening in the same setting but with serious faces, legal threats, and stern translators. But not here. Here, peace came dressed in wool sweaters and served with tea. Before leaving, the ambassador left a short message in the guest book of the local museum. It read, "To the people of the Isles of Scilly, may peace, even the silliest kind, always find you first." You step out of this imagined office and back onto the real cobbled paths of the Isles. The wind picks up a bit, a fairy horn sounds in the distance, and you start to feel the incredible rarity of what you've just learned. A war ended not because it had to, not because it was costing money or lives, but because someone asked a question, and someone else answered it. The kind of story that can only be real because it sounds like it isn't. And as you walk, you realize this wasn't just a correction of history, it was a triumph of curiosity, of kindness, of the delightful absurdity that happens when humans remember to be human. There are wars that end with treaties, and treaties that end with fanfare, but this one ended with a pen from a schoolteacher, a grin from a diplomat, and a handshake between two parties who had forgotten they were ever supposed to be enemies. The newspaper clippings that made it real wander now into a cozy little archive room tucked behind the Isles of Scilly Museum, the kind that smells like old ink and yesterday's tea, where newspapers rest in heavy-bound volumes so thick they could double as footstools here. Beneath flickering yellow lights and on shelves leaning just a bit to the left, lives the final burst of attention this bizarre conflict would ever get, because once the treaty was signed, the press did what the press does. It turned a quiet oddity into a headline, and that's our mainstream historical fact within days of the treaty's signing in 1986. Newspapers across Britain, the Netherlands, and eventually the wider world published the story of the longest undeclared war in history, sparking laughter, confusion, and a mild diplomatic blushing on both sides. The Times, The Guardian, even the Washington Post picked it up, each adding their own spin. Some focused on the absurdity, others emphasized the charming symbolism of such a lingering technicality. The headline in the Isles of Scilly Gazette, "Peace at Last," beneath a black and white photo of the Dutch ambassador shaking hands with a Cylonian councilman, both looking like they were trying not to laugh. And for the quirky fact, one London tabloid got a bit overexcited and printed a front page story claiming, "Dutch Navy finally withdraws from Isles," suggesting that there had been some sort of low-level naval presence this whole time. When a reporter called a local harbor master to confirm, the confused man replied, "The only Dutch boats we've seen lately were pleasure yachts, and they left with more wine than they arrived with." The article was quietly corrected the next day, but not before it sparked several letters to the editor demanding the Prime Minister reclaim Cylonian sovereignty. It was the kind of story that had just enough truth, just enough charm, and far too much room for interpretation. But not everyone took it as a harmless laugh. That's where the scholarly debate creeps in again. Some academics and political historians criticized the entire affair as a distraction and unserious spectacle in an era grappling with real-world conflict, Cold War tensions, and rising global instability. Why should we waste diplomatic energy on a fictional war, they argued, when real diplomacy is stretched so thin? But counter-arguments quickly rose. Others contended that such stories served a different but valuable purpose, reminding the public that not all international history is built on trauma. Some of it is, miraculously, built on misfiled paperwork and corrected misunderstandings. And in a time of mounting political cynicism, a story about peace declared out of sheer curiosity offered something rare: hope, albeit in miniature. Leaf through the clippings, fingers grazing over headlines like "War ends without a single cannonball" and "Longest war ends in sandwiches and smiles." The tone ranges from cheeky to heartfelt. One editorial, written by a columnist in Cornwall, closes with, "Let this be a lesson. If you don't check your inbox for 300 years, someone might throw you a peace party instead of a bomb then." There's the Dutch take, elegantly understated. A piece in Die Volkskrant titled "A Treaty for Tea and Tulips" calls the gesture a symbol of Europe's enduring connection, even when it forgets itself. It reads, "In this tiny story, we to see the best kind of history, absurd, polite, and full of people who'd rather laugh than fight." And that really was the tone most people embraced. The story quickly took on a second life. Tourists to the Isles of Scilly began asking for the War Museum, though none existed. One local pub renamed its best-selling ale to Dutch Retreat, and a bakery began selling truce biscuits, oatmeal cookies with a tiny paper flag poked into each one. No one really cared whether the story was important. They cared that it was delightful, and that it reminded them of something most histories forget. That peace, too, can be accidental. You sit back, eyes resting on a final yellowing clipping tacked gently to the wall. It's a cartoon, drawn in pen and ink, showing two ancient generals leaning over a chessboard, both saying, "Your move," simultaneously. Beneath it is scrawled the caption, "Game over." Took a while. You can't help but smile. In a world overfilled with bombast, endings like this feel gentle, almost whispered, like a joke only the most patient people get. And now, so do you. You rise from the archive and step back out into the fresh island air. A seagull floats lazily above, and a local kid bikes past, carrying two baguettes under one arm and humming what sounds suspiciously like the theme to a 1970s detective show. Nothing about this place feels like a battlefield. It never did. And that's the final twist, isn't it? That peace could be declared in a place where war never felt real, but history still demanded closure. A treaty for the sake of tidying up, or finishing the sentence with a polite full stop instead of just walking away. The press turned that into a story. The people turned it into pride. And you, lucky you, got to be here long enough to see how the softest kind of history unfolds, not with drums or parades, but with newspaper clippings and oat biscuits. A war remembered with cake and tea. You are sitting now on a low stone wall overlooking the sea, the waves lapping against the rocky edge like an old dog breathing in its sleep. The Isles of Scilly, still breezy, still modest, offer no grand monuments to the longest war never fought. There's no marble statue of Admiral Trump, no cannon displayed on a grassy lawn. What there is, however, is a modest annual celebration. That's right, our mainstream historical fact. After the peace treaty was signed in 1986, the locals of the Isles of Scilly decided to commemorate the oddity every year with what can only be described as the gentlest victory festival in history. Every April, the community holds a peace day, not with firecrackers or reenactments, but with open-air picnics, local music, and a short reading of the treaty under a small white tent. There's even a poem read aloud by one of the school children. The whole thing lasts just under 2 hours and wraps up with sponge cake, tea, and sometimes a screening of a documentary titled The War That Wasn't. It's about as dramatic as a damp blanket, but in the most comforting way imaginable. And for the quirky fact, one year, the town tried to spice things up by holding a mock battle using inflated swords and buckets of flower petals. The event ended prematurely when one of the buckets flew off a cart and hit the mayor's sandwich. The mayor, to his credit, declared it the first and only casualty of a war that's seen worse fates. Since then, the battle has been replaced with a quiet scavenger hunt because apparently even pretend violence was too rowdy for this peace-loving bunch. And what about the scholarly debate? It lingers like a polite argument at a dinner party that everyone's too well-mannered to actually finish. Some historians question the legitimacy of holding a celebration for something so trivial. They argue that in a world where most peace treaties cost thousands of lives, this one risks trivializing the work of real diplomacy. Others fire back that this is exactly the kind of story we need to remember, that absurdity has always been a part of history, and to ignore it is to sanitize the human condition. If we only memorialize the tragic, one lecturer wrote, we teach ourselves to believe history was only ever painful. But history is also weird, and weirdness deserves footnotes too. You sip a cup of weak but comforting tea and glance at a cloth banner strung between two trees. It reads, "Peace, 335 years in the making." As you chuckle. Not because it's funny in the laugh-out-loud sense, but because it's so wonderfully human that someone took the time to stitch that message, to haul a ladder into the grass, and to hang it with twine and care. Speaks to the quiet power of community rituals, even for a peace that nobody knew they were waiting for. And as the sun edges west, bathing the stones in gold, you hear a local guide recounting the tale once more to a group of mildly sunburned tourists. She's good dry humor, gentle sarcasm, pauses in all the right places. She ends with, "So, yes, technically, we were at war with the Dutch until 1986, but don't worry, they brought cake, not cannons." The group chuckles. One woman writes it down. Maybe she'll tell the story at her next dinner party. Maybe she'll forget the names but remember the strangeness. And that's enough. You wander past a small gift shop that sells commemorative truce mugs with the words, "Better late than never," printed in old-timey script. There are bookmarks shaped like tiny scrolls, fridge magnets with cartoon ships shrugging at each other, and even a children's book called The Little War That Took a Nap. It's all charming. None of it would make sense in a world driven purely by logic. But this isn't that world. This is the Isles of Scilly, where time moves like fog over the ocean's low, lazy, and occasionally forgetful. You walk further, drawn toward the edge of the island, where the land gives up its ambition and simply lets the sea win. And in that liminal space, you feel the weight of what's past, not a battle, not a loss, not even a victory, but a long, slow breath of history finally exhaled. There's something to be said for endings like this. Not everything needs a bang. Sometimes, all you need is a letter, a treaty, a handshake, and a good cup of tea. And so, this war, if you can call it that, joins the strange bookshelf of stories that remind us history is not a straight line. It is not always noble. It is not always grand. Sometimes, it is ridiculous. And in that ridiculousness, it is deeply, utterly human. You close your eyes, the sound of gulls and waves now blending with the memory of typewriter keys and clipped diplomatic greetings. The kind of peace forged not by fire, but by curiosity. The kind of peace that ends in sponge cake and subtle smiles. The kind of peace we should all be lucky enough to inherit. The wind that carries forgotten triages you're walking now along a slender sea-facing path near the southernmost curve of the Isles of Scilly, where the cliffs slope gently into the waves and the wind seems to remember more than people do. This is where it ends, not with a monument or a museum, but with a breeze that carries stories no textbooks bothered to archive. As your boots tap against the gravel, let's take one final look at this most peculiar war, and the even more peculiar peace that followed. Let's savor the strange, quiet humanity behind it all. Because tonight, our mainstream historical fact is this: the Treaty of Peace signed in 1986 was never officially ratified by a formal legislative body. There was no act of parliament, no vote in The Hague, and certainly no international legal binding ceremony. It was, in essence, a ceremonial gesture to parties acknowledging and amusing oversight and correcting it with civility and grace. And yet, the act was deeply meaningful. That's the secret sauce of diplomacy. Sometimes, what matters most is not what's legally required, but what's symbolically right. The fringe fact is even softer around the edges. After the treaty was signed, the document itself was misplaced for nearly a decade. Yes, you heard that right. The document meant to end a war forgotten for 335 years was itself lost. It was eventually rediscovered in a municipal storage file, nestled between ferry schedules and property tax receipts. When asked how that could happen, one clerk replied, "Honestly, it didn't look very important. It was mostly typed in Arial," and the open scholarly debate that swirls to this day. It's a question about memory, how societies choose what to remember and what to forget. Some scholars argue this treaty reveals how history is shaped not by its significance, but by its story-worthiness. Wars that kill millions are remembered with solemnity and detail, but wars that harm no one, those get forgotten unless someone, with a sense of humor, rediscovers them. Others argue the opposite, that every piece of history, no matter how absurd, deserves space in the human archive. That by embracing even the smallest diplomatic oddities, we create a fuller picture of who we are. Somewhere in between those viewpoints lies the truth, nebulous, like sea mist on a late spring morning. You sit for a moment on a wooden bench at the edge of the world, looking out toward the Atlantic. It's hard not to imagine some forgotten 17th century Dutch sailor squinting at these same waves, unaware that his government just declared war on a smattering of British rocks. You imagine him laughing, not out of disdain, but out of the sheer absurdity of it all. Maybe he never even got the message. Maybe he just sailed home with a hold full of dried cod and the smell of salt in his beard. You also imagine Roy Duncan, the man who started it all again in the 1980s, reading about the peace ceremony in the paper and making himself a second cup of tea. What did he feel? Satisfaction, vindication, probably amusement, that he, with a few letters and a curious mind, managed to rewrite a historical footnote into a full paragraph. Not everyone gets to do that. And then there's you walking this path, picturing treaties signed with handshakes, festivals that celebrate peace with sponge cake, and wars that existed more in theory than in blood. You didn't expect to care this much about a war that never happened. And yet here you are, watching the wind, remembering a story most people never knew existed. You hear a bell in the distance, probably the afternoon ferry coming in. Somewhere nearby a tour guide is finishing up her loop with a final line, and that's why we always double-check the filing cabinet. The group laughs. Another day of storytelling complete. And so it comes to a close. A treaty forgotten, then remembered. A war declared but never fought. A peace so polite it barely made a sound. In all of history, very few stories carry this kind of tone. Gently ridiculous, softly significant, and wonderfully human. But now it's time to let it settle. Let the ink dry. Let the flags flutter once, then fall still. You exhale, letting the cool air wrap around you like an old wool blanket. The story has ended, and yet, like all the best tales, it leaves something behind, a question, a chuckle, a warm sense that not all history is teeth and tragedy. Some of it, delightfully, is just misplaced paperwork.